meeting of the London Assembly Transport Committee. Can I welcome members, officers and the public today at our meeting. I also believe, I'm not sure if they're here yet, we've got some students joining us from St Lawrence University London programme who are studying an Encountering Global London module. So if you're here, I hope you find this morning's discussion of interest. Can we make sure everyone's electronic devices are switched off or on silent to avoid any interruptions? And if members wish to wear masks, they can, or members of the public, it is your decision. Can I start off to see if we've got any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence from Assembly Member Desai.
Lovely, thank you. Let's move on to item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and if members have got any other interest to declare? No, noted, thank you. Minutes, item 3. Can we confirm the minutes of the Transport Committee meeting held on the 9th of February 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? Agreed, thank you very much. Item 4, summary list of actions. Can we note the ongoing closed and completed actions arising from the previous meeting of the committee and the additional correspondence received? Thank you very much. Item 5, can we note the action I've taken as chair of the committee under delegated authority in consultation with the deputy chairman and party group lead members, namely to agree the report, Williams Schaps, the committee's response to the plan for rail, and the letter to the Secretary of State for Transport about London's finances, TfL's finances. Thank you very much. Let's move on to item 6, our main item today. And this is our annual question and answer session with the Commissioner for Transport for London, Andy Byford. So welcome, Andy. It's a delight to have you before us today. And we've got a range of questions to ask you. But if I can kick off, and it almost picks up from our last meeting where you kindly were here giving evidence, could you please give us an overview of the new funding arrangement for TfL, including what it means for your ability to plan for the future?
Sure. Well, thank you. Good morning, Assembly members. Good morning, Chair. Thank you very much for the invitation to come back before you. These sessions are always very insightful because it's good that we're able to share with you what we've currently got on our plate. And surprise, surprise, budget is one of those main items. It continues to dominate my time as Commissioner. And the most recent deal, as you'll be aware, was just concluded or just within the past few weeks. So we have got a new a financial arrangement with Her Majesty's Government, for which, again, we're very grateful. We've now secured something just short of £5 billion worth of support made up of an emergency grant and a loan facility since May 2020. And a big shout out to our CFO, Simon Killenback, and the team, because the work is actually, the word I'm going to use is exhausting. It really is exhausting for us to continue have to undertake these very intense discussions with government. But we are where we are. So we have another shortish term agreement that will take us through to the 24th of June. And that, among other things, allowed for an additional £200 million worth of extraordinary support grant for the first 3 periods of the year. And also, it's important to note the true-up mechanism is still retained. So the true-up mechanism being the difference between what government have assumed the revenue will be and what the actual is when that calculation is done. So we still get made good via that true-up mechanism. Now, in addition, there were a number of conditions. There's always 3 elements for me that I look for. What's the duration, what's the quantum, and what are the conditions? And you'll recall that when the last short-term settlement concluded, and we'd had an extension of the existing deal, twice we had to have a 1-week extension. Now, you might ask, why was that? That was because, in our considered opinion, the conditions that were being proposed were unacceptable. So we wrote back to government on that basis, and largely that was one of the conditions, which was around the need to find an additional £400 million worth in savings in year. Now, the reason I concluded it was my decision that that was unacceptable was because you already know that we're committed to finding 730 million in savings. That's not an insubstantial amount. We've already found 300 million in-year savings as a one-off. So to find another 400 million against an already tough backdrop to me was a bridge too far. So there were two week-long extensions while we argued this out with HMG. And we did succeed in that regard, although we still have to find 400 million. It's a plan to find that, and critically, we insisted that inflationary costs could contribute towards that plan, because we shouldn't underestimate that. Like the rest of the country, we're seeing inflationary costs. So that plan, we will submit it, but we can include inflationary costs to be considered as part of that overall objective. And then the final point to make is HMG also committed in the letter to telling us by hopefully the end of this month what the capital funding might look like as part of a long-term deal. Don't forget, folks, that's the holy grail. That's the prize. We must move off these short-term deals. I'll come on to the second part of your question momentarily, excuse me. What they've said is they will let us know what the quantum looks like, and then they are minded from June, when this shortish term deal expires, they are minded to give us a 1 to 3 year capital deal. So I'm pushing for 3 years. Why? Because it answers the second part of your question. The shorter the deal, the less room to manoeuvre we have. It's very difficult, almost impossible, to run a £10 billion enterprise when you only have a very short-term window in order to properly plan. You can't leverage better prices off contractors. You can't let contracts with certainty. We've got bus contracts stacking up. We've got other critical decisions that we cannot take with confidence, or even with financial probity in mind, because we can't be certain what our financial position will look like. So we're going to push really hard from this next deal, critical deal, this is the big one, to get a 3-year capital deal of sufficient quantum that gives us the room to manoeuvre. Plus, we will still need around 900 million of government support up to April 2023, by which point we won't need any more revenue support. That would enable us then finally to be able to say that we've sorted out TfL's finances post-COVID.
And has the government indicated that they're minded to give you revenue support up to 2023 in June as part of this sort of ongoing discussions you're having?
Well, they've certainly, to be fair to HMG, throughout, they've always said it is our intention to support TfL. They recognise that COVID has had a calamitous impact upon TfL's finances, which is true, it has. But what we've not yet secured is that specific. Our view is it will take an additional 900 million to take us through to the end of March 23-24, by which point we're committed to being financially self-sustainable. The definition for that being we can cover our operating, our maintenance, and our cost of capital costs from that date, which would be a remarkable turnaround. If you think that we'll have achieved a swing of -2 billion to back to being financially self-sufficient, that will be a remarkable turnaround, and we're very focused on achieving that objective, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Now we're going to come on right towards the end to look at things like road pricing, but can you give us a high-level overview of other options TfL is exploring to raise further funds?
Yes, well, you'll be aware, Chair, that the Mayor has already committed to a fare increase. In fact, we just announced the fare increase, which was RPI plus 1%, and that was consistent with government's expectations that that should be the amount. The Mayor has also committed to a precept on or a levy on the council tax precept. So that's been agreed to as well. Plus, the Mayor has directed TfL to explore, in line with your question around RUC, we've been directed to explore the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone as a means not to raise money, and I stress that, as a policy objective, but a policy objective that would also have the benefit of raising revenue as a side benefit, not the primary objective. If you imagine a ledger, on one side there's what London will do and what the Mayor will do, and on the other side what government will commit to do. HMG have made it very clear that they expect TfL and the Mayor through TfL to identify additional sources of support between 500 million and £1 billion a year, if in return for the kind of capital monies that we're seeking, to which I referred earlier.
Okay, are there any other areas that you're looking at? Obviously, you've mentioned road pricing, ULEZ, but are there any other areas under investigation at the moment?
That's the primary one. We did, as you know, explore the Greater London boundary charge. That is no longer being pursued. But ultimately, what we want to do is, and you indicated we'll come to this later in questioning, we do believe there's a lot of sense in moving ultimately to a much simpler, I might call it holistic road user charging arrangement, which would effectively subsume and succeed all of the schemes that we have at the moment, and that's something maybe we can explore later when you're ready.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And finally from me on this section, we've obviously seen the recent industrial action on the underground, bringing London to a standstill really. What's your view of that recent industrial action by London Underground workers, particularly given, as far as I can see, that there isn't there aren't cuts on the table at the moment?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate. It only relates to the RMT union, not ASLEF or TESA or the other unions. Now, look, I understand, thinking of my frontline colleagues, I do understand that this is a real period of uncertainty. There's uncertainty across the whole country at the moment, obviously exacerbated by current events. The fact that we're undertaking a pensions review has caused uncertainty, not just for frontline unionised workers, but also for colleagues, colleagues around the organisation. But our view is that this is premature. We've been meeting regularly at ACAS with the RMT to try to explore how we might resolve the dispute that we just had, the 2 one-days, which were incredibly impactful on our customers and in my view, unnecessary. And why do I say that? The union has said that there's 3 primary reasons for having that industrial action, namely 1, concerns around pensions, 2, concerns around jobs, and 3, concerns around terms and conditions. And again, we feel that that's entirely premature. The reason being, all we have committed to with the government as a result, as a condition of an earlier deal, was a review, and I stress that word, an independent review of the pensions scheme which we all currently enjoy. That review is ongoing. It's chaired independently by Sir Brendan Barber with a lady called Joanne Seegers, but Joanne being an expert in pensions, and that will report with recommendations by the end of this month. Now, those recommendations are not binding on TfL. We will take a look at them. Obviously, we'll have to submit the report to government, but there's no predetermined outcome. So we've been able to say legitimately to both the unions and the frontline colleagues, there are no changes planned to the pensions scheme as it stands. There aren't. I do not know, as the Commissioner of TfL, what those recommendations will be, what that report will conclude. I don't know. It's an independent review. So reason number 1 for the strikes being premature is that pensions. Number 2, job cuts. We have indicated that we'd like to talk to the unions about a 500 to 600 reduction in headcount on stations, but we would achieve that through attrition, in other words, not filling vacancies, and we would do that by also spreading the impact across stations and reviewing the station staffing model, keeping stations staffed, absolutely, maintaining things like turn up and go, but taking account of the fact that customer behaviour has changed. Most customers don't use ticket offices, not that we have ticket offices, but they're pretty self-sufficient. They're using their smartphones in terms of information. So again, no jobs will be lost. So to me, that's premature to strike on the grounds of job cuts when we are not proposing anyone currently working will lose their job. And finally, in terms of terms and conditions, that was the 3rd element that the RMT cited. We have not proposed changes to terms and conditions, and were we to do that, we would do that through the agreed machinery. So for now, the union hasn't announced any further dates, but were they to do so, my argument would be exactly the same. I understand that there's uncertainty, but right now the 3 conditions upon which they took industrial action are premature. There is no reason for the adverse impact on both our finances and, more importantly, our customers.
Lovely, thank you. That's very, very clear. Thank you for that. Let's move on to other members. Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner. I'll start off with a couple of questions on capital funding. And you've mentioned the that it would be much better to have longer deals, that you're pushing for the upper end between 1 and 3 years. But also, I know that last year that you said that we must have a stability and certainty of 5-year control periods for the funding of major capital investment projects. So what difference would this between a 3-year and a 5-year make to Transport for London, and what further impact would it have if you can only achieve the 1 year? Does that make sense?
Sure, no, it does, absolutely.
This, you know?
Well, just set your mind at rest, Assembly Member. I mean, I haven't given up on my desire to have a 5-year capital funding deal. I think that's entirely reasonable, and the examples I cite and continue to cite, I've cited to government. Why are we treated differently? Network Rail enjoys 5-year funding periods, what are called control periods, as does Highways England. And so to me, that makes compelling sense for both parties. The government, the primary funder, gets certainty of output. In other words, they say, well, here's the capital funding we're prepared to supply, but in return, we want the following deliverables by the end of that 5-year period. And you know, I'd be more than happy to sign up to close scrutiny to ensure that that happened. And then the receiving agency, in this case TfL, benefits from certainty of knowing it's got 5 years funding, you can plan properly, you can, as I said earlier, you can leverage better deals with your contractor, you can achieve economies of scale, you can really map out what a long-term capital program would look like in the way that all other major entities do. Now, it does appear, well, certainly at the moment, there's no prospect of a 5-year deal, but I would take this right now. If someone said to me, and I put this to government, if what could be offered is 3 years certainty, because bear in mind they said 1 to 3 years, so I'm pitching hard for 3, the upper end of that spectrum. If we could get 3 years, plus then, without money, just a comfort letter, some certainty on what the ensuing years would look like. So in other words, it's not 3 years, then that's it, done, no more funding, but 3 years with a view to renewing it, such that you know that after that you've then got 2 years more certainty, or maybe another renewed 3 years. If you offered me that today, I'd take it. And the reason being, I would at least then be able to let contracts with certainty. Everyone would know, the industry would know, TfL's not about to go out of business. TfL's not about to pull the plug on contracts. That would be an acceptable outcome. So that's what I'm pitching for. Give me 3 years of the right quantum without onerous conditions and a comfort letter to take us forward beyond that. And I think that would be an acceptable deal.
Understood. Thank you. And now I just want to ask for some specifics about capital funding in terms of projects. In TfL's submission to the spending review last September, had several asks in it, including zero emissions buses and step-free access. Are the projects in that submission still the ones that you're asking for support with? Are those still the priorities? And can you explain which one, how you've come to the conclusion of which ones are the priorities?
Sure. Well, at the moment, we haven't finalised the budget because, of course, we can't until we know what monies we've got to play with. So I would put that one caveat on my answer. But our prioritisation remains job 1, maintain state of good repair. And I mean that across the whole spectrum of activity, okay? Not just the tube, not just rail, not just buses, but streets as well. Maintain state of good repair. Before you look to do anything new, before you look to do any sort of extensions or buy, nice new kit, you maintain the state of good repair, because that is always job 1 for any transport undertaking. And so once you've secured that, you then look at what are your other priorities. And absolutely, to your question, they remain such things as delivering on our environmental objectives, because, as I've always said to government, let's take electrification of the bus fleet as an example. That addresses myriad issues that are complementary to what government themselves want to achieve. They want to see employment generated by viable businesses. They want to see a decarbonised UK by 2030, and they want to see levelling up. Well, guess where we buy those buses? Not in London. We buy them in Ballymena, Northern Ireland, Falkirk, Scotland, Guildford, Surrey. So there are British manufacturers who would love to provide us with those electric buses. We would like to have them. There would obviously be capital investment required also in electrifying the garages so that the charging points get installed. So that remains a priority for us. Step-free access, absolutely. I've always been a big advocate of that. I was very pleased to see just last week the mayor went to one of my old stations, actually. I used to be the group station manager of Harrow on the Hill. I'm delighted to see Harrow on the Hill now almost take us to 100 stations that have been made step-free. So that is also a priority of ours, as is current priorities such as re-equipping the Piccadilly line with new trains. I would dearly love to re-signal the Piccadilly line. To me, it's crazy to provide new trains and not to provide new signalling. And at some point, we really must then address the other issues, such as right now, today, it's 2022. That means happy birthday to the Bakerloo line. Those trains are 50 years old. Now, wouldn't it make sense, once we finish building the Piccadilly line trains, to have a follow-on order for Bakerloo line trains? That would make so much sense. You could leverage a much better unit price. So those are the kind of priorities that we still want to see. But again, I'll finish where I started. We can't finalise the detail until we know what we've got to play with regard to the capital contribution from HMG.
Thank you. And looking at larger projects, back in January 21, TfL published their financial sustainability plan, which outlined how the major growth schemes such as Crossrail 2, Bakerloo Line Extension and Sutton Tramlink were not going to be an immediate priority. What would need to happen before those schemes would be part of the conversation again?
Well, right now, as you rightly identify, they remain on the back burner. The work we've done to date is not wasted. The work has been archived. The route has been safeguarded, certainly for Crossrail 2. And the archiving, and credit to one of my former colleagues, Michelle Dix, is absolutely superb. So everything's ready to go. So to the second part of your question, if we could move to sort of sunnier uplands and have get to a position where we've got a much better financial outlook in terms of capital, then we could progressively bring some of those schemes back into the envelope. They have compelling business cases. Crossrail 2, I believe, has a compelling business case and would provide the same economic transformative impact as the Elizabeth line will have, but this time on a north-south axis. Bakerloo line extension into the currently unserved areas such as Camberwell. That would be a fantastic scheme, extending the DLR similarly. But because we know that we won't have sufficient funding to do those schemes and to maintain state of good repair, and the most pressing priorities such as 49-year-old Piccadilly line trains, 50-year-old Bakerloo line trains, they have to take precedence.
So they're not even part of the conversation at the moment?
They're below the line.
And how long, you've got plans in place that could go at any time, how long before those plans stop being valid?
Well, the work again. The work is archived, so they won't time expire. In that we have worked very carefully to document everything we've done to date. We have worked with the government in terms of safeguarding the route. So by safeguarding, I mean making sure, for example, that where you know that the route is going to go and the outline designs have been done, that something doesn't get built that would then be in the way, literally. So there's no immediate threat to that, and so there's no real time limitation on them. But having said that, obviously, if a lot of time elapses, you have to go back and revisit the business case because things that change over time, costs go up, economic circumstances change. So we would need to dust all that work off. But we could, if your point is, could it be resurrected pretty quickly? Absolutely, it could.
Okay, thank you. I want to follow up on the moving off of capital funding. I want to ask about the additional up to 400 million that
Sure.
the savings revenue that was in the last. I do think it's a short-term deal. I think we're so used to 1 year week deal. I think up to June is definitely still short-term. Mm-hmm. So, and you said putting together a plan. What sort of things are you having to look at for that additional up to 400 million?
So what I'll just quote, I mean, we basically have to come up with a plan to achieve up to 400 million of additional revenue or cost savings in 2022-2023. In other words, the current year. But at my insistence, as I said earlier, we are able to include inflationary pressures because we should not underestimate those. The economic headwinds on TfL, not uniquely to TfL, same as for everywhere, right? Are not insubstantial. We've got cost pressures in terms of wages. We've got cost pressures in terms of utilities, you know, the price of electricity, etc. We are receiving less. We're getting less income than we thought we might from the expanded, the currently expanded ULEZ zone. There are a number of cost pressures upon us. So I'm not going to say what the proportion will be of already sunk costs, if you like, in that 400 million plan, but we made it very clear that were that to have been a net 400 million of pure savings, that was impossible. On top of the 300 we've already found, on top of the 730 to which we're committed, that was a bridge too far. That's why there were 2 one-week extensions. I just said I cannot agree to that.
Okay.
To be fair, or rather to be absolutely frank and blunt, it would have been reckless on my part to have agreed to it. There are some out there who said just agree to it and don't deliver. That's not how I operate. Because I knew that we could not achieve that, it would have been reckless and irresponsible to sign up to that. I would not do that.
Understood. Thank you. Just going back on something that you mentioned earlier on around the proposed job cuts, 500, 600 job cuts. I understand those are through attrition. Do you have concerns? And while how people buy their tickets may well be changing, we've all seen that happen. Do you have concerns in terms of the service for people who need additional help, access issues in such a large number of jobs off the network?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're very alive to that, and the last thing that we want to do is to water down what is, I think, a very good customer offer. I'm very proud of our stations colleagues. I used to work on stations myself. I'm very proud of them. They do an excellent job day in and day out. But what we are saying is that in these very financially constrained times, and in light of changing customer behaviours and changing customer travel patterns, it does make sense to make best use of the funding we have and to therefore deploy people with logic, but protecting the needs, the need to provide service to those less able and more vulnerable people that need it. We're very mindful of another factor, which would be women and girls' safety. The turn up and go service, we're not going to impact that. So any changes, and we're already discussing this with the unions, will be fully consulted, and we will make sure that a number of lenses or filters are applied so that we don't inadvertently create a safety risk. You know, these changes would need to be very carefully thought through, but again, I stress that anyone who currently works for LUL will continue to work for LUL. There will be no job cuts. What we would do is take out a number of positions, and we'd do that through not filling vacancies and through attrition. In other words, not filling new vacancies as people leave.
So it sounds to me, without putting words in your mouth, you can tell me if not, that these aren't job cuts that you would choose to make if you didn't have to because of the financial situation.
Well, certainly that's the catalyst. But equally, albeit I'm a passionate believer that transport is a is a public service. Equally, when you are recipients of public funding, you should spend that money wisely. It's not our money; it's taxpayers' money. So we've always got to be mindful of the fact that we must run a public service efficiently and in a business-like manner.
Thank you. And finally, I've just got a couple of questions around the London Underground cleaning contract. Mm-hmm. So in July last year, the Mayor asked Transport for London to review the cleaning contract with ABM. Can you update me on the status of the review and whether TfL is minded to insource the contract?
Yes, that review has concluded, and the decision that we have taken as a management team is to extend that contract for a further period. Now, that doesn't rule out in the future that we would revisit that decision or further review the status of our cleaning service. But for now, we have concluded that we just cannot justify in-housing, insourcing, if you like, the cleaning contract. It would just be too expensive at a time where we're already incredibly financially constrained.
And how long is that extension going to be for?
That's just being sorted out at the moment. Okay. There's a number of options, so I shouldn't really comment on that until the commercial discussion has happened, if you don't mind.
Is that decision going to go through I understand that the previous contract went through the board, the TfL board. Is that contract going?
Yes, any contracts would go through the board. We'd still need to confirm if our decision, once it has been finalised in terms of the duration of the contract, that would absolutely go to the board, yes.
And can I ask, this has obviously been because the cleaners are, let's face it, the staff who have the worst terms and conditions on the underground, priority for the trade unions. Have the trade unions been involved in that? Have they had a chance to put forward proposals or options around this?
Yes, we have discussed this with the trade union, and there's no reflection here on the quality of the work that the ABM cleaners have done. On the contrary, I was delighted just the other day to see the most recent sampling done by Imperial College, which for I can't remember the exact number of cycles. It might be 10 now. For let's say the 10th time, not a single trace of COVID has been found on any touch point that was sampled or any air sample that was taken. Not a single trace, and that's testament to the excellent work that our cleaners do. Nothing's. Never say never. For now, though, it's a stark reality that right now we have concluded we cannot afford the in-housing or insourcing of the cleaning contract, and that's a management decision. It's not a political decision, and that's something though that we will keep under review going forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Just for the record, when we talked about the Bakerloo line extension, you talked about it going to Camberwell. I can assure you, sadly, that battle was lost many years ago. It's going down the old Kent Road.
My mistake.
Just
That's
that
my
on record.
lack of geography having been away
Camberwell
for too
residents will be
Sure.
pleased to hear you say that, but I just want to make that clear on record.
I stand corrected, Chair. Thank you very much.
Don't worry. Assemblymember Bailey, you've got a question on this, and then you can move into your next section on COVID recovery.
Thank you. I'll try to be swift with this. Morning, Commissioner.
Morning.
Just a few tidy-up questions. You talked about the ULEZ extension, the second proposed extension, but did you give a figure for how much revenue you think it may raise?
No, we don't have that to hand just yet, but it would be a contributor to what government has said the Mayor needs to address on his side of the ledger. Remember I talked about ledgers earlier, namely that we should be looking to raise revenues, albeit this isn't a revenue raising scheme, of between 500 million and £1 billion per year. So it will be made up of a series of different interventions, but we have not yet quantified that because we haven't done the design yet. We've just been asked to look at the expanded ULEZ. So the figure is not one that I have to hand as it stands.
Okay, thank you. It's just an inquiry because, of course, there'll be a cost to extend the ULEZ as well, won't they?
There will, in that you would have to undertake quite extensive capital works to put up the necessary cameras and the other equipment in order to expand the boundary. So that would be a factor that certainly in the early stages that would need to be offset, and certainly it's something that we will be seeking government support on when we get into that detail around what capital quantum we're going to be given by government.
Okay, thank you. And on a slightly different topic, would you have advised the Mayor to tie himself into a 4-year inflation-busting pay rise for some of your staff?
Well, to be fair to the Mayor and to my colleagues who were here at the time, no one knew what inflation was going to be when the deal was struck.
But isn't that the point? Shouldn't there have been a cap put in?
I think that is a learning point going forward. A cap is something I would certainly always advocate for, particularly in light of what we now know. That when it was struck at the time, a cap wasn't applied, and it was the deal was RPI +1. no one, I don't think, expected inflation to balloon to the sort of 7 and 8% that we've now got. And certainly in deals I've struck elsewhere in other transit properties across the world, I always think a cap is a safe mechanism.
Was a cap suggested by TfL's executive at the time?
Assembly member, I honestly don't know. I wasn't here at the time.
Would it be possible to write back to me about that? Or the
I can ask the question, sure.
Thank you very, very much. My last small point would be around, for this section, would be around trust and negotiating with the government. How do you think the levels of trust are between yourself and also then separately between the mayor and the government?
Well, certainly, I can't really speak for the mayor and the government. I can surmise, but so I can only really speak with confidence about for me personally, but then for TfL. So I think there is a level of trust. There's a level of, I think, respect would be a better word, a level of respect between TfL and Her Majesty's government, because we've always sought, and I'm a stickler for this, we've always sought to be professional. So in an earlier answer to one of your colleagues, I said that I wouldn't sign up to something knowing that I intended to renege on it, or that I intended to sign up to something and then not do it. I just wouldn't do that. So my direction to my team has, we must maintain the moral high ground, no negotiating in public. If we strike a deal, we stick to the conditions, we deliver on the conditions. We've had multiple conditions in the various deals we've had to date, and we have not missed a single one. We've met all of our conditions, and a lot of them are quite onerous, actually. So I think there's a level of trust. There's a level of mutual respect in that this is hard, this is exhausting, this is difficult, not just for ourselves, but also for our colleagues on the side of DfT. I think there's also appreciation for the fact that I've always said, and I'd say it deliberately and it's sincerely meant, I genuinely do appreciate the support that Her Majesty's government have given us. The Exchequer has so many problems at the moment and so much pressure on it. I really do appreciate, and £5 billion is not an insubstantial amount of money. And on a personal note, I largely liaise with the Permanent Secretary, Bernadette Kelly, and we have an excellent relationship. And I think that's necessary in order to smooth the wheels of what inevitably becomes a bit of a politically influenced debate.
Mm-hmm. I mean, your attitude to this seems to be very good, and there seems to be a level of respect there. And of course, we would all concur that the £5 billion, almost £5 billion, is a huge sum of money. But it's things like when you all talk about the conditions of pay of one of the more large conditions being that you raised fares. But didn't the mayor already have that in the business plan prior to the pandemic?
Was there an intention to raise fares?
Yes.
Prior to the pandemic? Well, as we know, there was a fares freeze before the pandemic, but that, my understanding, predated me. It was not that was forever. There was always provision for fare rises at a certain point. So a fare rise was anticipated, but not necessarily of RPI plus one. The RPI plus one was a stipulation of one of the financial settlements that we struck.
My memory was it said RPI plus one in the 2019-20 plan. But the point is, I've asked for you to write to me about that. I'd really appreciate a response to that. Thank you very much. Moving on, can you provide an overview of TfL's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, including the current ridership levels across the network?
Interestingly, I get a daily report on ridership, which is normally a couple of days out of date, because obviously it takes a little while to just do the analysis. So the figure for Saturday was highly encouraging. I'm doing this from memory. I looked at it earlier today. It was something like, on Saturday, 89% of normal ridership on the buses, and I think it was 81% of normal ridership on the tube, normal being the 2019 figure. And that's fairly consistent with what we're seeing on the weekends. Weekend ridership is very strong, so it's coming back. But having said that, at Monday the 7th of March, so more looking at the weekday, tube travel 59% of normal demand, bus travel 75% of normal demand. So we are seeing, now that Plan B is receding behind us, the weather is improving, You know, business people are coming back to the offices. There's the beginnings of a return to international travel. You know, you only have to cross Blackfriars Bridge and you can see plane after plane going into London City now. Ridership is picking up, but it's not yet clear when we would get back to anything near 90% plus. That's still to be determined because there's a number of variable factors that are at play.
Does the high ridership on the weekend and the lower ridership relatively in the week suggest that that's actually a behavioural change, maybe a permanent behavioural change?
I'm not sure we can say it's permanent yet. What we can say, though, is, well, Mondays and Fridays are the quietest days. There's a lot of people doing Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays in the office. We are in touch with entities such as the CBI for London, with London First, the West End Company, really trying to get intel from them as to what major employers are saying to their workforce, and for that matter, government. You know, what are government saying to government departments? Our civil servants, for example, being required to come back to the office. You know, what can we assume by way of ridership throughout the week? So I think it's a bit too early to say, but certainly I'm encouraged by the weekend ridership. That shows that people have confidence in public transport, that they're using it in numbers, and I think that confirms we adopted the right strategy in sticking to running very, very high levels of service, not slashing service, as happened on the main line railway, such that we had the capacity once the numbers returned, but also in our messaging around that it's a safe, clean, secure environment, and customers certainly are voting with their feet.
Okay. What are the latest trends in mode share in London, and what impact has the pandemic had on these?
In terms of mode share, for 2020, the mode share was estimated for overall for mode share was 58.3%. Now that compared to 63.2% in 2019. The number, so I'll try and break that down a little bit. Proportion of Londoners achieving at least 20 minutes of walking or cycling per day decreased during 2021 to 37%, and walking accounted for 60% of all trips by Londoners during the first quarter of 2021. So we have seen some changes in terms of mode share, but what I have been encouraged by is the number of people now who have discovered the joys of cycling and walking, I think many of whom won't necessarily revert back to how they previously got around if their journey is contained within town, with the various changes that we've made with bike lanes and widened pavements, etc. So if what's behind your question is, are we still on track to achieve the mode shift? I think that's still achievable, the Mayor's goal of 80% by 2041, but I think time will tell as the economic recovery rolls out, as hopefully COVID recedes into the distance.
My real focus actually is about where we direct the funding to. We often talk about cycling and walking. It'd be useful to split those two things out, because one has had significantly more funding than the other, but we have no evidence that that's the one that's been taken up more than the other. You know, if we understand who walks, who cycles, then we can spend the money in the right place. We've done extensive work on this committee about the danger of junctions in London, and I believe personally that's a real stops people walking, quite frankly. There's lots of junctions where I live, my children are not allowed to walk over without me. So that split would be very useful.
Sure.
What are you anticipating for the rise in TfL fares? What impact do you think they'll have on ridership numbers?
So the March fares changes deliver an overall increase of 4.8%, and that's consistent with that funding agreement requirement to which I referred earlier. And that will be part of assisting us to reach financial sustainability, but it won't in itself solve the funding gap. It's a contribution to the overall amount that government was looking for the Mayor on his side of the ledger to achieve. So 4.8% is the fare increase that's now gone in.
What impact do you think that will have on ridership, if any?
We always evaluate the elasticity of fare changes, because obviously if you made the fare change exorbitant, you really pushed it, let's say, I don't know, a 10% fare rise, you just wouldn't do that, because it would be counterproductive in that you would probably lose, almost certainly you would lose more ridership than you gained, and you'd actually end up losing money. So we have quantified that. I mean, I'd have to put in writing to you the specific, but we do not believe that that will have a detrimental impact on public transport usage. On the contrary, we think that that's a reasonable amount that will still enable us to provide an increase to our bottom line in terms of revenue, while not having an adverse impact on ridership.
Okay. Has the freezing of fares for the last 4 years been effective? Has it contributed to TfL's financial difficulties?
I feel we've answered this question on a number of occasions, but I'm happy to answer it again. So, I mean, obviously there was an impact in the fares freeze cost over the 4 years, which were 2016 to 2020. That cost around £640 million. But having said that, again, it's back to that elasticity point, because you can't apply the elasticity argument only in one way. In other words, say, well, if there's a big fare increase, you shouldn't do that because you might inadvertently, or you might directly then impact numbers of people riding because the fares have got too expensive. Well, similarly, that argument applies the other way, in that if you do freeze the fares, yes, you lose the revenue, and that's the figure, 640 million, but you can thereby generate more demand, which partially offsets that loss of revenue, because people feel that it's still affordable. So on that same period, we've previously said the fares freeze generated demand pre-pandemic worth £150 million. And what we didn't see on either our rail or bus networks, we didn't see the same drop-off in ridership that occurred on the main line and in the bus networks. And we would argue that that was because we kept fares affordable. As I said previously, you've got to look at the elasticities. So yes, that the fares freeze did cost some money, but equally it kept people riding who might have otherwise been tempted to get into their cars. The key reason why we were in the financial trouble that we were was because of the pandemic. That had a calamitous impact upon our finances.
I accept that, but there's a lot of things in your statement. It makes an assumption that people had a choice. You said bus to car. Most people who ride the bus that I know don't have a car as an option, as an alternative. That's normally not the way, if only because of parking.
Or bus to walk. I take your point that if you can't afford a car, you may end up walking. But that's the reason why sometimes, fares policy is very sensitive. Mm-hmm. If you freeze for too long, yes, you would lose that revenue is foregone. You're never going to get it back. But if you keep putting the prices up, keep putting the fares up, you will make it unaffordable, and you will end up losing more revenue than you gain.
Yes,
there's very sensitive elasticity.
It's a balancing act, but the figures you just quoted would suggest that money was lost. But putting aside the question whether the fares freeze was a mistake or not, could you see the Mayor making a similar promise again?
I've no idea. You'd have to ask the Mayor. I don't wish to be facetious, but I've not heard the Mayor say that. That would be a question best posed to the Mayor, and I would suggest you're better placed to pose it.
You're completely right. Far be it from Assembly members to be cheeky. Chair, back to you.
There's an opportunity next week, Mayor's question time. Perfect. Let's move on to Crossrail. Assembly Member Rogers. Very exciting area.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner.
Morning.
When you've spoken to us previously about Crossrail, you've spoken about your window that I think was due to close at the end of June for the reopening, of the central section. So how are you doing with that window, and do you have a current planned date for the opening of the central section of Crossrail?
So I'm very. This is. I have to say, I'm glad you asked the question. It's my favourite topic. Where I said I spend a lot of my time on funding, almost the remainder of it is spent on the Elizabeth line. It's something I'm very passionate about, as you know. So I can confirm this morning, absolutely, we remain on track to open the Elizabeth line, the phase 3, which is the middle section between Paddington and Abbey Wood, within the first half of this year, so by the 30th of June 2022. which is, of course, the date to which I committed. I committed that to you. That date has not and will not slip on my watch.
Thank you. But you don't have a current planned opening date specifically?
We have a date that we are working towards, but until I'm certain, because respectfully, you've had enough dates come and go, until I'm certain that we can open on that particular date, I'm not going to commit to it or publicly opine on it. I don't think I would be being respectful to you if I were, because, as I've said, there's a lot of dates come and gone. I'm determined to stick to my promises. It will open by the 30th of June, but rest assured that one of the 3 challenges that I set my team in taking direct responsibility for Crossrail, which I didn't have to do, but I took it on, was to get that first phase open within the first half of 2022, but to get it as far to the left, if you like, as possible. And I'm very confident that we will be able to announce an opening date soon.
Okay. And what would you say is the biggest risk to the opening that you're currently looking at?
Well, that's a logical follow-on from the last question. We must make sure the service is reliable. So here's a very quick overview. 9 out of the 10 stations are now complete. The only station that is an outlier remains Bond Street, which under TfL direction, don't forget we've had direct control of Bond Street now since October 2020. That was 18 months behind. It's now about 3 months behind. So the person I brought in from, with whom I worked in Toronto, he's not Canadian, he's American actually, he and the team have done a remarkable job in bringing it back. But as I've said previously at this committee or elsewhere, I won't wait for Bond Street in order for us to open. Let's get the central section open and Bond Street can follow. What's called trial running is complete and finished. Trial operations, which we're currently in, where we're practicing scenarios, is virtually complete. I was on the Elizabeth line yesterday, where 1,600 volunteers participated in a mass exercise. It was the last mass exercise of the trial ops program. But to me, the biggest risk remains reliability, that we must make sure that all of the elements work reliably, particularly the train. The train isn't as reliable as I need it to be just yet. So once we're done with trial ops, what I want to see is a number of weeks of literally just running the service up and down, up and down, up and down, to make sure that the most recent software drops did the job that they were meant to do, didn't allow for regression. In other words, retrospective introduction of bugs, and to make sure that we open and that it is flawless from day one. That's my objective.
Thank you. So when you say the trains aren't as reliable as you would like them to be yet, what sort of issues are you seeing?
It's very specific now, actually. There's not a generic problem with the train. They are good trains. I mean, don't forget, we're already, I know you know, we already use these units, what are called Class 3, 4, 5s, out on the main line out west and out on the main line out east. And so they're fundamentally good trains. The traction's good, the door operation's good. They are good trains. But we have a number of issues still with just some specific systems interfaces at particular locations that do cause delays, not every day, but when they do, given the intensity of the service, I would not want to expose the public to that from day one. So we need to just iron them out. Every week we have a summit, tonight's is the latest, with the CEO of Alstom, who are the train manufacturers. I make a point of participating in those sessions. So if we can just get these specifics sorted out, and there's one more software job to do at Easter, we can crack this. I'm very confident on that.
Are you able to share some of the specific locations you're having issues with, just so we have those on our radar, you know, for accountability?
We seem to have a problem with what's called the boundary. It's like it's a system. It's a geographical boundary where the signalling system and the train overlap or have to switch from one system to another around Stratford, and for some reason yet to be identified, we do get occurrences of the emergency brake applying. So there's no safety risk as such, but the train stops and then has to be reset. Now that doesn't sound very impactful, but if we were running service with customers on, you don't want the train to just stop an emergency brake application. So only yesterday I was talking to the technicians. We think we've identified what the problem is. They were using handheld laptops to look at electronic noise, and we think there's some sort of electrical interference there that is causing the trains to apply the emergency brake. So no safety risk, but it would be a service impact, and that's one of the that's a good example of what we need to iron out. We'll get there.
Thank you. You've touched on Bond Street. So you say currently three months behind. Are you bringing forward? I guess maybe you can give us an overview of what the latest is with Bond Street in a bit more detail. And also, are you bringing forward any plans for partial opening, which you've discussed before?
Sure. So we did look at that at my request. There's two ticket halls at Bond Street, an east and a west, and I asked the team to look at could we bring forward the opening of one of the ticket halls, bearing in mind that initially customer numbers won't be as great as we thought they might be pre-pandemic, and could we open one ticket hall and then follow on with the other one in due course? We've ruled that out, and the reason we've ruled that out is when we looked at the design of the fire life safety system, so in like the fire alarms and the the sprinklers and all the sensors and everything else, they really have to operate across the whole complex. You can't easily split them up. So what we concluded was that it would cost more and take longer to split them up and to do a partial opening than it would be to press on and get the whole thing finished. So it was worth having a look at, but our decision is to press on with the whole station and to get that open as soon as can be safely and reliably done after the central section opens.
Oh, thank you. And so when you say 3 months behind, we said before that the station is 3 months behind. So is that 3 months from the end of June, or 3 months sort of generally behind the overall programme?
It's broadly beyond the end of June, July or September, but there's two issues. One is physical completion, and we're nearly there. Mike Dunham and the team have powered through it, and if you go through Bond Street, as I did the other day, and I know a number of you took a ride, you can see it looks almost finished, and it is almost finished. The physical construction is nearly there. But as with all the other stations, once you've done the physical construction, you're then doing the systems testing, and then you have to do what's called safety assurance and make sure that all of the assurance has been done for that location. The good news is, where previously we had a number of stations to do at once, everything else is finished. There's a little bit of work just to do, assurance work to do at Canary Wharf. So we can apply the full expertise of the team to focus on Bond Street, and that is happening. I've also asked for maximum paralleling of activities. In other words, while the construction team are finishing off, let's get started on some of that assurance work. As we heard from some of the other locations, so that we can get Bond Street into service as quickly as possible. So I've got my A-team on it. It will not be that far behind the opening of the rest of the line, where previously it was, 18 months behind.
Can I just ask members to make sure that their phones have got their Wi-Fi hotspots or something turned off, and maybe the Commissioner as well? The mics are crackling a bit, and I'm told it's to do with hotspots on phones. I don't really know what that is, but there you go. That's my message. Back to you, Assemblymember Rogers.
And when do you anticipate having an opening date for Bond Street? If you can answer.
I would be able to say that with certainty, so I don't want to predict. I'll be able to say that with certainty once my team give me a summation of how long they think the assurance process will take.
Thank you. You've touched on trial operations. It seems that every transport enthusiast I know has been volunteering for them. I just wonder, how have they gone? What sort of issues have emerged, and what sort of changes or tweaks have you made as a result of the learnings that you've had?
Trial ops has gone very well, actually, and that's and basically, for anyone watching, what trial operations is as the name suggests, you're practicing operating to make sure that you're both competent and confident when the line opens. You need both of those things, because you can be competent but not confident, and confident but not competent. So you've got to be both. So we use test scenarios. There's around 150 test scenarios, ranging from a a detrainment in the tunnel, a train-to-train emergency transfer, escalator failures, fire issues, persons under trains, unlikely with platform screen doors. But you're practicing all sorts of different scenarios. They are then scored. They have assessors who either issue a pass, a fail, or a pass with comments. So most of the exercises have either passed or passed with comments. Where they've failed, it's been typically nothing substantial. It's been, for example, someone forgot to announce something or forgot a key part of the procedure. So that's the whole point of it. What we then do, if there's a fail, the exercise has to be rerun. If there's a pass with comments, those comments go onto a learning log so that we learn from them. So, the first emergency evac we did took longer than it should have done. It was safe. There were no problems in terms of anyone getting hurt or anything like that, but we need it to be quicker. I would have been highly suspicious had every test passed. I would have asked them to probably, I'd have had a very close look at that. You never get a pass on all of the activities. So I'd say the ratio is about right, actually, and we're almost done with trial ops.
Thank you. And have there been any patterns that you've seen in the types of ops that have failed?
Not particularly. Typically, it's unfamiliarity with processes because, again, it's back to that competence issue. You can study a booklet so you know a procedure. It's only when you then use it in anger that you've realized, do you really know it? Or do you need more practical training? This is why we do trial ops. You can't just learn how to run a railway in a book. You've got to practice. I remember doing that as a duty station manager. I knew how to secure a route. In theory, I went down the tunnel and practiced, and I'm glad I did.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. What's the latest update on funding needed to complete the whole Crossrail project, and have you secured that?
Sure. Remember I made reference to I set my team 3 challenges. One was to get the central section open by the first half of 2022, and we will. The second was to expedite the ability of customers from the east to go through the tunnel and from the west to go through the tunnel sooner than what we inherited from the outgoing Crossrail board, and we will. The third was the most tricky because it's absolutely dependent on the first 2, and that was to try as best we could to deliver the remainder of the project within the 825 million out of the 1.1 billion that the outgoing Crossrail board identified. So with the huge caveat that you'll recall, we have always maintained we probably need up to the 1.1 billion. I've never conceded that. We continue to do our damnedest to hit as close we can as to 825. That was always a tough ask. At the moment, there's a pressure of between 150 and 170 million over and above that 825. Is that a done deal? Not yet, because that will still be influenced by prolongation. The biggest cost draw on a project is how long that project goes on, for obvious reasons. You've still got the team engaged, you've got contractors engaged, and you're not earning revenue. So we need to safely get this thing across the line as quickly as possible. We've had huge success at demobilizing very expensive tier 1 contractors. A number of them have now left the job. We've settled with them commercially. There is still risk contained in the budget for which there's a financial provision, and that can partially offset some of that pressure. So will we hit 825? I think that's going to be a real tough ask now. Will we need 1.1? Very confident, no, we will not.
Okay, thank you. And are the remaining phased openings of Crossrail on time as it stands now?
Yes. I mean, again, we don't have a specific dates. What we're saying is that the very clever hybrid option that we identified, remember the outgoing Crossrail board said 2 more phases after that, but they needed to be concurrent with Network Rail timetable changes because trains will be going out onto the main line. You can't just have them turning up willy-nilly out of the tunnel. Would have to be concurrent with the December 22 and the May 23 timetable change. Why? I've posed that question. Why? It's sometimes good to have a new person just say, well, why is that? So we're saying we're aiming for sooner than the December timetable. change, being able to have trains from Shenfield go through to Paddington without having to change at Liverpool Street, and from the west, from Reading and Heathrow, being able to go through the tunnel without having to change at Paddington. So we're aiming to do that in the autumn. The final change would have to be concurrent with the Network Rail timetable change. So it would, earliest would be December of 22, more likely May of 23. And that's the point at which you really have achieved end-to-end running. In other words, literally Shenfield through to Reading, through to Heathrow without having to change.
So your hope would be end-to-end running by May 23?
By May at the latest, absolutely.
Okay, lovely. Right, thank you very much, Commissioner.
You're very welcome.
Lovely, thank you. Could I just pick up with you some clarification in terms of the opening window? Could you open Crossrail in the pre-election period?
There's two issues there. There's technically ready and there's in a fit state for it to be sufficiently reliable. So we're aiming to get what I would call technically ready within the next, literally within the next few weeks. And that means all stations available with the exception of Bond Street, all safety assurances signed off, the Office of Rail Regulation happy, literally all staff trained, everything ready to go. We're not far off that. The pre-election period, obviously we're aware of it, that would not preclude you opening. It would mean that you couldn't do a sort of a grand opening because there's obviously rules around the pre-election period. But there's a fundamental difference, in my professional opinion, between being technically ready and being ready in a fit state for this railway to be as reliable as we want it to be. I want the service to be fit for the surroundings. Londoners have waited long enough. I think they would not thank me were we to open in a rush to beat the pre-election period, for example, and for the service then not to be reliable. Apropos Assembly Member Rogers' questions, I can think of plenty of big projects where they opened and day one, week one were absolute shambles. We do not want that. I want this thing to be flawless from day one, and if that means taking a few extra weeks of running up and down with no interference of trial operations, so be it.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I just wasn't clear whether you could open the railway in that pre-election period. I recall there were issues when the phase 2 of the East London line opened, and that was around an election period. Right. Because one would assume that day one, the Mayor of London, who is chair of TfL, would want to attend and be on those trains and carry out publicity. That couldn't happen in the pre-election period.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're mindful of the pre-election period, but I'm not allowing... I'm always mindful of politics, of course, in my job. I'm respectful of the job that you do. But I am singularly focused on the job in hand, which is to get the Elizabeth line open, but for it to open only when we're certain that that it will be fit for Londoners. In other words, it will be safe. Absolutely, it couldn't open if it wasn't safe. But I want it to be super reliable. So although it won't be long before the safety assurance is signed off, and so technically you could open, but I want to be certain that the train reliability issues, and to be fair, there's some issues. We've had the odd problem with doors, the platform screen doors. I want to be certain that we've understood the root cause of those and that we've ironed them out. Because in any railway opening, you're going to have a few teething problems. That's okay. But what you do not want is to open with a big glitzy event and for then there to be multiple service impacting failures. No way. People have waited long enough. We spent enough money on this for Londoners to rightly expect it to be an excellent service from day one, and that's what we're focused on.
Yeah, I fully understand that, and we would expect you to be running the trains to make sure. I just would have thought the Mayor would want to be with you on day one.
I'm sure he would.
Influence when it may open.
I'm sure you would like to be chair.
I'm sure we all would love to be there, absolutely. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Try and help you a bit, Commissioner, with the strange noise you're hearing at Stratford. I think it must be West Ham fans cheering a goal. But in all seriousness, you said that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that by December 22, my residents who use the Shenfield line will be able to get to the central section via Liverpool Street, change at Liverpool Street, if that is correct. And if that is correct, when they change at Liverpool Street, will it be at the current terminus, or would it be actually at the underground level?
Sorry, maybe I don't think I misspoke. Maybe you didn't quite catch it with the interference
could have
we were having.
misheard it, don't worry, I've heard it.
By December, in fact, sooner than December, earlier than December, we intend to actually do something more imaginative than what we were originally bequeathed by the Crossrail Board. The Crossrail Board's plan at the time, no disrespect to them, but the original plan, which we queried, was to have that December date, because it was concurrent with a Network Rail timetable change. We had to think about it, and there's a way of expediting that, but also obviating the need for your residents to change. So what I'm saying is, sooner than December, someone coming in from Shenfield won't have to change at Liverpool Street. They would be able to go through the tunnel through to Paddington, okay? And then going the other way, coming from the west, they would be able to go through the tunnel through to Abbey Wood. And the reason you can do that is because as long as you don't come out the other side, you're already operating on the overground section out east and out west respectively. But as long as you stop then at the opposite end of the tunnel, you don't then have that potential impact on the mainline trains coming out of the tunnel, for which you must have concurrence with Network Rail timetables. You can't just present at any time. There's got to be it's got to be consistent with a timetable change. So your residents will get that benefit sooner than what was originally proposed. And that was a challenge I set to my team, and one of the guys came up with that as a really good idea.
I think that's brilliant. Obviously, as much as we all love Paddington and East London, where we really want to get to, though, is Heathrow.
Sure. And you'll be able to do that, as I said to Assemblymember Rogers, no later than May of 23.
Okay.
It's possible you could do that by December 22, but it's a big ask, because a number of factors need to be present. But May 2023, I'd be very confident that we would have proper through running by then.
Okay. Is it possible, Chair, that we can ask for just for you to send us some written details on that, because it's quite complicated.
Just the next phases, perhaps
Sure.
we could have in writing. Yeah,
we're actually developing graphics as well, because it can be a bit complex, right? So we are developing some graphics so that customers, particularly when the middle section opens, don't get confused, because they'll think, oh, Crossrail's fully open, because at the moment the Elizabeth line is open out west, it's open out east, we're going to open it in the middle, so people might assume, oh, you can go all the way through. For a period of time, you won't be able to, so we want to use graphics, simple graphics, to illustrate that there are a number of phases. Just for the record, because on occasions, I still see people say, oh, Crossrail have had to admit it's going to be open in phases. No, that was always the plan. That remains the plan, but the news actually is better. We're expediting one of those phases. We've come up with a way of doing it more quickly.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Let's move on to our next section on London's river crossings. And thank you for your reply, I think we received last week, Commissioner. How will you take forward our report into river crossings, particularly our recommendation, which was around formalising the Thames River Crossing Coordination Group?
Yeah, so, I mean, largely our previous reply stands. I don't have a lot to add to it. But the key point is that there is a group, as you know, which meets on a quarterly basis, and they have a comprehensive overview of what works are needed and what's coming up, etc., etc. There are a number of other groups. I'm told that it's not my area of expertise, but the London Bridges Engineering Group, the Thames River Crossing Coordination Group, and I think I've understood your position rightly, that said that is effectively to formalise that would enable you to have better scrutiny and for there to be better communication about the closures. So we're not averse to that. We do recognise, and we can always revisit that recommendation, but we would note that it's not totally within TfL's gift. It does require central government and others, because it's not just our group. It is, as the name suggests, a coordination group. I'm
So we're
happy.
wondering how you might take that forward. 'Cause
Sure. Well,
generally, your response was quite positive.
mhm.
It's just how you might take that forward. I realise you've been preoccupied with Crossrail and finances, but hopefully within the next few months you'll be
Sure.
able to move beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, we're on the case. We've got, we're aware of your views. I get the rationale. I just want to make sure that we don't set up a body that is just another committee that we have to attend. It's got to have a purpose. So let me come back to you on that once I've consulted my experts to make sure that we do set something up that's meaningful and that we would have other parties' agreement to the formalisation of that body, because it's not within my gift to just commit to it. Other people have to commit to it too.
One of the other issues is the ongoing funding of river crossings, and in some ways it's too much for individual boroughs and TfL at the moment to find the huge amount of money that's needed to help maintain some of these assets. And we suggested about a collective fund for those who wanted to put money in, a bit like a sink fund, if you like, that you have in a building, for example, to help pay towards major works. Will you look to sort of see whether that could be moved forward with partners as part of this work?
Well, I think that would be, that's the logical next step. I don't think it would be easy to administer, because just as TfL right now is in a very difficult position, continues to be financially, so are the boroughs. So I don't think too many boroughs are going to be committing to massive expenditure on bridges just yet. But certainly in our deliberations around your first point, namely the coordinating group, finances would be an obvious first point of consideration for that group. So in our response to you, we'll cover that as well.
Lovely, thank you. And looking at other river crossings, the cable car, which obviously some of us have used to commute now, Assemblymember McCartney and I the other week, though it's going up to £5, goodness, I think that's going to be an occasional treat rather than a regular commute. But your tender for a new sponsor was finished at the end of February. I understand that there were no expressions of interest. So can you update us on sponsorship for the cable car,
Sure.
please?
My understanding is somewhat different, and
Okay.
I was at the cable car just last week. Actually, we're undergoing the annual programme of maintenance to make sure, effectively, to look at the state of it, and occasionally you have to make adjustments to the guide wire. So we're very proud of the cable car. My understanding is that we have had interest, nothing that would enable us to let a contract yet, but there are a number of agencies or companies that are interested in sponsorship, and we're continuing to have that dialogue. We know that we need to find a replacement for Emirates. I'm confident that we will find someone, but I can't yet say who that will be because nothing's moved beyond the expression of interest stage. But my understanding is we have had a number of such expressions.
Do you have a timescale for when you hope to make any decisions?
It would need to be pretty soon. I just have to check on when the current arrangement ends. I'm just seeing if I've got that here. But certainly it needs to be within the next few months.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few members who want to come in. So I've got Assemblymember Clark, Prince, and then Berry.
Thank you, Chair. Andy, last month, TfL's Programs and Investment Committee published a paper on TfL's asset renewals, which said that, quote, the state of good repair of road assets has been declining for the last 5 years. I'm concerned that this leads to more accidents and acts as a barrier to active travel. What has led to this decline of our roads and bridges?
My understanding is that obviously, in order to maintain a state of good repair, you have to have regular interventions in terms of keeping things properly maintained. If you leave structures, big physical structures, be that a bridge, be that a road, be that a flyover, for protracted periods, or if you don't undertake the right level of maintenance, then that there is a risk that that asset will degrade over time. It's a known fact. The practice has been, due to lack of funding over the years, sometimes maintenance gets deferred, and it's something I always try to resist as the CEO of a transport company, because I think ultimately it's false economy. Ultimately, what you end up doing is paying more than you would have done had you maintained that state of good repair. But the simple, harsh economic reality is that tough choices have to be made. So on occasions, yes, we do defer maintenance. We do so with regard to safety. Obviously, we wouldn't defer safety if we couldn't. But if, for example, you do not stay on top of your road surfacing, then over time potholes will appear, the surface will degrade. You will probably expedite the point at which you have to undertake a full surface replacement, rather than if you had maintained regular maintenance interventions going along. So there are other factors. The actual use of a facility, if its usage is higher than the design for which it was intended, that can have an adverse impact. In other words, if, for example, one of our old bridges is carrying way more vehicles of way higher weight than it was originally designed for, that can be a factor. But the primary reason, in my opinion, is lack of maintenance over a protracted period of time.
Thank you, Andy. And I mean, I really see this in my own constituency, particularly with the Brent Cross flyover that hasn't enjoyed regular maintenance, and now it seems very unlikely that it will receive a large cash injection with the Brent Cross regeneration. Just to clarify, is it correct to say that London receives no government support to support our roads and bridges?
Well, if you're referring to VED, for example, no, nothing. Where the rest of the country benefits from extrapolation of VED to be funded back into that area's roads, bridges, whatever the infrastructure might be, but typically roads and bridges. London, which raises something like 500 million vehicle excise duty, all of that goes to the national exchequer, and Londoners do not benefit from that.
Andy, thank you, Chair.
Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Just to talk about East London, as you'd expect, and as you know, Barking and Dagenham Havering have no river crossings. There was talk around a foot crossing, and we know it was going to be a bridge, and that was cancelled. But then there was a discussion around a possible electric ferry for a foot crossing between Canary Wharf and south of the river. Do you know where we are with that at all?
Yes, that was mooted. That was one of the items, unfortunately, that at the moment falls below the line on our capital plan, because we do not have that certainty of capital funding. So it has been looked at. It's something that we think makes sense, but right now it doesn't make the cut.
Okay, that's fine. And also, could you just update us when we will have the long-awaited Silvertown Tunnel finished, please?
When we'll have it finished?
Yeah, when we'll be able to use it, as we can wait.
Can I come back to you in writing on that? I don't have that date to hand.
No problem.
The work has started. What I can tell you is the boring machine has arrived, the piling has started, the launch site, you can actually see from the cable car, funnily enough, you can see on the other side of the river, you can see the launch site, where the tunnel boring machine will go in, and all the enabling works is currently happening. I just have to check on the specific.
We should arrange a visit, Chair.
That would be very interesting, I'm sure. We, Assemblyman McCartney and I looked at it as we were in the cable car, but I think getting the timescale for that would be useful for the different stages as well. Thank you. Assemblymember Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just clearing up a few extra points in relation to what you were just talking about. In your response to the River Crossings report, the first recommendation we made was about potentially restricting the speed or volume of traffic on some of the bridges and tunnels, particularly for larger vehicles. Now, the answer we received from you seemed to mainly relate to weight as opposed to speed. And I just wanted to get some clarification. It does say adding additional speed and weight restrictions preemptively to London's road network is unlikely to assist with these challenges, but it would lead to longer journeys and additional pressure and congestion at other parts of the network. That is purely a reference to the impact of a weight restriction, not a speed restriction, is it not? And I'm pretty certain you wouldn't object if boroughs, road danger reduction campaigners were to ask for lower speed limits on roads. You wouldn't object to it on those grounds.
Well, I mean, so there's two issues here. On the broader issue of speed generally, we are always, as TfL, particularly on our own road network, looking at ways to make the system safer. So so speed is a factor, obviously, in safety, and where there is a case, a data-driven case, not a subjective case, but a data-driven case to reduce speed limits for a proven safety benefit, then we would always entertain that. Where it relates to things like structures on bridges, again, that could be looked at because that in itself could be a factor. My reference to weight was because it just stands to reason to me. If you've got a structure like, say, Tower Bridge, which was built in the Victorian times, where people could have had no idea that modern trucks would be as heavy as they are, or one of the other bridges for that matter, it's a factor. My point that I was trying to make was we don't think that speed and weight themselves are the dominant factors. We think environmental issues are more of an issue in terms of degradation over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just to be clear, you think that weight restrictions, i.e. restricting certain vehicles, might cause some of the problems you lay out, but in principle, reducing speeds don't introduce additional pressure and congestion on the rest of the network.
Well, I mean, if the traffic is, if you have a speed restriction, a universal speed restriction that forces everything to go more slowly, it could have an impact on congestion in that it depends where the traffic then presents at, say, a junction, but we model those things. So in any speed change that we make, we don't just make it willy-nilly. We look at what would the impact on the surrounding area be. Are any other changes necessary, such as changes to traffic light timings or junction workings? You model it to see what the impact of, say, a 5 or a 10 mile an hour speed limit would be. You do that before you make the change, because you would want to understand that you don't thereby introduce an unintended consequence such as, say, congestion, which, okay, the vehicles would de facto be going more slowly, but equally they're sitting there idling, and that would impact upon your environmental benefits. So you should always be holistic in any change that you make.
That's great. Yeah, just wanted to get some clarification on that. The other thing that we asked about in relation to the Silvertown Road Tunnel on the 9th of February were issues to do with the phasing of the scheme, but also the introduction of the road charging on that link. We haven't had any answers back yet, so will we get an answer back to that before the tunnel boring machine enters the...
Well, I mean, that's again back to what I was talking about, the way I tried to do this job. If we've promised you an answer, you should have an answer. I will expedite that as soon as I get back to Palestra.
That's excellent. And then very finally, on the cable car sponsorship, I'm assuming that any potential sponsors are also covered by the general restrictions that we have on advertising on the Transport for London network. We wouldn't accept sponsors who weren't allowed to advertise. Are you bearing other sort of ethical considerations into that decision as well, such as like another airline, for example? I'm thinking as an environmentalist.
I don't think we're ruling out another airline, but we're certainly mindful of the other restrictions on advertising, gambling, junk food, that kind of thing. I think that would seem to be somewhat counterproductive, that we say, well, you can't advertise on the tube, for example, if you're a gambling entity or a junk food advocate, but you can sponsor the cable car. Other than that, I'm not aware of any other restrictions, but we would absolutely look at any prospective sponsor to make sure that they didn't fall foul of any ethical concern that would be unacceptable.
Lovely, thank you very much. Our next section is on William Shap's plan for rail, and I'm sure you'll have seen our response to that. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you very much. Could I just, before I start that, could I just quickly go back to the point about reducing speed limits? The problem with reducing speed limits is they actually do add more to pollution, because that, I don't know whether you would agree, but it means that you've got more cars on the road for longer. Because clearly, if you've got a 40-minute journey, and that then becomes an hour or more journey, you're going to have to spend more time on the road, so that's more polluting. And of course, there'll be more cars because everyone's got to spend more time doing the journey. So whereas you wouldn't get an overlap, you do get an overlap of journeys. I don't know if you've done any research into that at all.
So, Assembly Member, I've made that point back to Assembly Member Berry that those are typically the factors we would include in any review of speed limits. We wouldn't just look at the safety benefit, obviously that has primacy, but we would also look at what unintended consequences or what consequential problems might occur, such as traffic jams, which might impact, to your point, pollution levels. And so you apply a series of lenses to make sure that in tackling one problem, you don't create another.
Thank you. So, on to William Schaps. What is TfL's view on the William Schaps plan for rail, and what risks and opportunities does it pose to TfL?
So we see a number of benefits to the William Schaps review. In fact, we feel that we can materially contribute to the work that review undertakes, specifically things like contactless ticketing. We are world experts at contactless ticketing. You know, we all benefit from it. It's something that other sections in the country can only aspire to. So we've got expertise within TfL, and we've offered that to GBR, the nascent sort of GBR, still to be properly set up. But I've been speaking with my colleague, the CEO for Network Rail, Andrew Haynes, about that. So we definitely see that there is a benefit there. We also see benefit in terms of potential further devolution of rail services to TfL, where there is demonstrable benefit to customers from bringing sections of the mainline railway under TfL auspices, with the coordination that benefits that ensue, the quality of service, the levels of service in terms of service operated, the branding, the consistency with the Oyster pay-as-you-go system. So we think there's a number of benefits, and we're very happy to contribute to the working of GBR.
Thank you. It's a good point you made about the contactless, because I did take this up with Network Rail or one of the rail providers. Is they're just coming to a stage where they're going to get their equivalent of our Oyster, whereas of course we've moved beyond Oyster really, and I would argue that there's probably not, I don't know whether you would argue, there probably isn't a case for having an Oyster, but going directly to people using their own contactless. So what is your view on that?
So I would agree, Assembly Member, and that's why we've proactively offered our expertise in that regard, and certainly there's interest at the DfT to have TfL provide expertise and assistance. And you know, I've made the point that that's why we should be partners in the wider entity about funding. Don't see TfL as a problem. See TfL as a solution. We can help your levelling up agenda. We can help the establishment of GBR and the success of GBR, because we've got expertise in London. We're not trying to keep that all to ourselves. We can help the rest of the country attain London-like service. But so therefore, more than ever, let's not have the irony of everyone gets London-like service and we somehow become suboptimal. How does that work? I'm happy to assist, but as long as it's a two-way partnership.
There is an irony in there, isn't there, whereby we're looking to have a London-like service, but why would we not consult with London to help you with the expertise on? Because I think probably TfL know how to run a London type service, probably better than anyone else. But there's an R in there. On the rail devolution point, which I think historically we have supported as Conservatives, but we've got some questions around it at the moment. And one of those is around, are TfL, with all the challenges that they have at the moment, really in a position to take on any more devolution? And the other question, of course, is around, if GBR was to be very successful, would there possibly not be an argument for GBR running the heavy rail side of TfL's business?
On the first point, yes, we've got to make sure we don't cut off more than, or bite off more than we can chew initially. And the job one, as I said earlier, is to maintain state of good repair of the existing system. So I would certainly prioritise making sure that the existing network is in a state of good repair and is properly funded before I supported taking anything else on. Albeit, I think that would have a huge benefit to customers, and I would argue ultimately the taxpayer, actually, because I think you get economies of scale. The heavy rail, we've no plans to hand over anything to anyone else, because my view would be there's massive benefit in having an integrated transport network, not just the tube separate from something else, but an integrated transport network of which TfL is an exemplar. You know, there's plenty of big cities I can think of out there, my last gig, New York, being a classic example, where I think they can only look with envy at how we coordinate everything. We oversee all of the modes, some of it through franchising, as you've mentioned, but we're all involved in every aspect, cradle to grave, of the transport planning and delivery process. And I wouldn't want to see that undermined in any way.
Just to press you, and you can use one of your broad delivery answers, which I respect. It's probably the best way to approach these things anyway. When do you think TfL might be in a position to take on any form of devolution, if it was offered?
It's hard to say. Certainly not before we have capital certainty. Once we've got capital certainty and I can be sure that the existing network is adequately funded and can be maintained in the state of good repair to which I referred earlier, I think then and only then could we countenance further expansion. And it would also depend really on what was proposed. I mean, it's a bit like buying a house. You do your due diligence before you take something on. So, you know, if it would depend on what we were being offered, how much of the national rail network and which bits, you know, what would be involved in taking on those sections, what support would we get in terms of bringing them up to a TfL standard. You look before you leap. We want to be certain that it would make sense and wouldn't actually inadvertently lead to further financial problems for TfL, because the whole point of what we're trying to do right now is pull out of that.
Sorry, then finally, obviously you haven't been offered any form of devolution at the moment. What do you think, or why do you think the government is seemingly reluctant to devolve services to TfL, other than the answer that Chris Grayling gave?
Other than what, sorry?
Other than the answer that Chris Grayling gave some years ago.
Oh, I didn't hear what
you
his
wouldn't
answer
want
was.
to devolve services to a Labour mayor.
Right. Well, I'm not going to get into the politics of it. I think it's for TfL to make a compelling case as to why we would support and why we would promote further devolution. We've got to prove the case that in doing that, there would be customer benefits, there would be financial benefits, there would be benefits to the local economies that benefit from those rail services. So I think it's incumbent upon us to make that case. And in some ways, the best way of making that case is to look at what's happened elsewhere. Look at the transformation of the London Overground. I've been around long enough to remember the old North London line and Silverlink, and back in the days, huge gaps between trains. The stations were in a very bad state of disrepair. The track was in a bad state of disrepair. People were put off using some of those sections of the overground. I remember when the District Line took over what used to be a British Rail section south of Putney Bridge, and they were like the stations that time forgot, some of those stations further south. And we progressively, in taking them over, brought them up to a TfL standard in terms of signage, platform facilities, customer service offer, level of service, reliability of service, customer information, all of the key attributes, which thereby encourage more people to use it, and you start a virtuous cycle of more people using it, more revenue, ergo more investment. We believe that there is a case to be made. It's all about the timing for me. Right now is probably not the time, because we've got to get our existing system sorted out and properly funded, but it's certainly not far from our to-do list.
Thank you. I mean, that's pretty much our position. And I must say that under TfL, the service that I use, Shenfield to Liverpool Street at the moment, hopefully to Paddington very soon, is vastly improved. So thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that. Thanks for the feedback.
Thank you. I think Assemblymember Prince is talking about his group's view, which had a slight variation on one of our recommendations, as you'll have seen in the report. Assemblymember McCartney, and then I have two other members.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Can I just say that I think London Underground has performed spectacularly well over the pandemic, and in stark contrast actually to a lot of the private rail companies. It's maintained almost a full service throughout. And I think, my thanks, I'm sure the committee's thanks to the staff.
Well, I very much appreciate that, Assembly Member. We're very proud of the Tube staff, and for that matter, other modes. We've carried on, we've kept at it, and that's to the eternal credit of our frontline colleagues, of whom I'm very proud.
Yeah, I think so are we. And I think that just shows the benefits of devolution. At a time of crisis, it really pays off. But can I ask, and I'm glad you've been talking to the chair of the Transition Board of Great British Railways, because in their recent call for evidence, they did not mention devolution once in the paper. Did that worry you, or are you actually having those conversations privately?
Well, to date, for clarity, I've largely talked to. It's actually the CEO of Network Rail.
Yeah,
and the DFT, primarily the DFT actually, but I've mentioned it to the CEO of Network Rail. But DFT, we have offered to assist on things like contactless ticketing, as we talked about earlier. So these are very early days, and I wouldn't want to give the impression that we're well down that road. The Williams Schaps plan is government-led, and so we can't drive that programme, but what we can do is proactively support it and offer areas of expertise. So that's what we've done to date.
But as far as you're aware, devolution is not off the table in that.
I don't believe it is, and certainly it's not something, apropos my earlier responses, it's not something to which we would be averse. On the contrary, we've always felt that there are certain areas of the national rail network in the London area, the Greater London area, that would be compelling candidates for further devolution.
Yeah, perhaps it won't surprise you to know that I'm going to raise the Great Northern Rail again, because you were obviously working closely with the DFT on a possible devolution of that line. I have to say that where I get on that line every day, mine is to Hertford, but at the other end, on the Welling end, is Grant Schaps, one Secretary of State for Transport, who in the past has actively lobbied for TfL to take over the line. So I'm ever hopeful he will grant that request. But last time I asked you about this, you said that work had stopped because of the pandemic. Do you see that starting again? And particularly, if you get a good capital settlement in June, is that sort of a date that you can start forwarding those plans? Well,
certainly for two reasons, I'd like to think so. One, because we would have more certainty on capital in terms of the actual amount of capital support that we could expect from government. And two, because if it were a 3-year settlement, it means I could then release legions of people who are currently tied up with these endless short-term deals onto more, I'm going to say, positive deployment. rather than having to every 6 weeks or whatever it's been. You know, it's varied the numbers of dates, but sort of monthly or 2 or 3 months funding deals. That is hugely time consuming. And as we emerge from the pandemic, we get the Elizabeth line open, we should get that long-term deal sorted out, then we're in a much better place to get back to, in a measured and calm way, doing what I want TfL to do, which is to really drive the agenda forward. And so, in answer to your question, yes, I would hope that the fact we'd have certainty on money and we'd have some precious free time to think would enable us to revisit lines such as the Great Northerns.
Good, and I started my questioning by doing the stark contrast between London Overground maintaining its full timetable. For example, on my branch of the Great Northern Line, off-peak, it's down to 2 trains an hour. And if one is cancelled, which is not an irregular occurrence, it becomes an hourly service, which means that residents just cannot plan, you know, and it's stopping people from going back to the railways, actually. But I also wanted to ask, if I can, about the capital programme and the Piccadilly line signalling. You said earlier that you have some priorities that you're asking the government for in that capital programme. Can I take it as read that the Piccadilly line signalling is one of your key priorities?
It certainly is. It is a priority, but being a priority and being funded are not necessarily the same. So we are, again, waiting to see what our capital settlement will look like so that we can see what makes the cut and what doesn't. The higher the line in terms of the capital available, the more you can put into what needs to be done. And the reason I feel so strongly about Piccadilly line signalling is, obviously, it's safe. I mean, we wouldn't be operating if it wasn't safe, but it's on a very old fixed block signalling system, which means that you're very limited in the number of trains that you can run, because trains have to effectively travel over a fixed block between signals before another train can follow on. Whereas modern signalling is what's called moving block signalling, and the trains talk to each other rather than rely on line-side signals. And the existing equipment is very, very old. It's very maintenance intensive. There's lots of kit that needs to be maintained, and the older it gets, the harder it is to maintain, literally finding spare parts for it. So that, plus the fact that it just seems to me crazy to have a brand new train, which are being built in Goole in East Yorkshire, a brand new train that is capable of and compatible with CBTC modern signalling. It's such a missed opportunity to not re-signal the line at the same time as we're building new trains and rebuilding the sidings, yards and the depots. Total route modernisation, that's what I advocate.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you. Quick question, just picking up on a point that you made, Commissioner. You're talking about devolution, and you say that there are certain sections of the main line in London that you see as particularly compelling candidates for devolution. I suppose you're almost coming at this with a fresh pair of eyes. There are routes, such as the one Assemblymember McCartney touches on, that have been discussed for a while. But I wonder, what are those areas? What are the compelling candidates for devolution in London?
Well, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment specifically on franchises, because that's I just don't think that's appropriate without talking to those franchisees. But typically what we would be looking at is the inner suburban routes that serve London termini. So within the Greater London area, we're not talking about mainline routes, we're not talking about trains to Exeter or something like that. We're talking about high frequency commuter lines that serve London termini. So Assemblymember McCartney made reference to the Great Northerns. That has been in the public domain before, so that is an obvious candidate. But lines like that, where you've got high numbers of people coming into a London terminal from not too great a distance, from in or just outside the London boundary, they're the obvious candidates.
Lovely. I think you've asked the question that the rest of your group wanted to ask there as well. So thank you for that. Let's move on to the Mayor's transport strategy. Assemblymember Garrett.
Good morning.
Morning.
So how has the pandemic impacted the Mayor's goal of achieving 80%
mode share for active, efficient, sustainable modes as he defines them?
Well, I gave you some stats earlier, so I will just repeat them for clarity. So the overall active, efficient and sustainable mode share travel, which was estimated in 2020 at 58.3%, that is down on what the figure was for 2019, which was 63.2%. And the proportion of Londoners who have been achieving at least 20 minutes of walking or cycling per day decreased during 2020-21 to 37%. Walking accounted for 60% of trips made by Londoners during the first quarter of 2021, and that's typically over 50% during other periods during the pandemic. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have seen more people taking up cycling, more people taking up walking, but certainly once the pandemic recedes, I would want to get us back onto the trajectory towards that 80% aspiration of the MTS by 2041.
Could I, just on that, by the way, echo the point that my colleague made earlier. Figures are always quoted as walking and cycling, and I think it's unhelpful to merge the two together because they're often the demands that they place on the transport network are quite different. The kinds of projects that enable one or the other are quite different. And I think that the public debate often tends to concentrate on cycling, and when you break it out, a figure might be, for example, 23% modal share walking and cycling, and it turns out it's 21 and 2, let's say. So I think I'd echo the point that it would be helpful to separate those out. I think walking ends up being the forgotten mode of transport, which is actually very heavily used. I don't know whether it's in your power to separate those out, or who makes that decision.
We do typically separate walking and cycling. I mean, let me take that away and just make sure that it's sufficiently granular such that we can meet your expectation.
Thank you very much. On the Healthy Streets programme, so that's obviously often delivered by boroughs. So how is TfL continuing with the Healthy Streets programme? And what work is ongoing with boroughs on that?
So we are continuing with our Healthy Streets programme, and that includes on a regular basis looking at what boroughs want to do, albeit in a very difficult financial circumstance. At the moment, we're not able to commit to boroughs in the way we would like to. Yet another reason to get our financial settlement sorted out long term, such that we can commit with confidence. But we do have a number of schemes that are ongoing. We are maintaining our scrutiny of those schemes in conjunction with boroughs, so that if either they need to be made permanent, tweaked, or taken out, that is something that is a well-rehearsed process. So, but again, it's done through careful analysis. It shouldn't be subjective or knee-jerk. It should be done through careful analysis. Did the scheme achieve its intended benefit, and or has it had unintended consequences, and does it therefore need revision?
Okay. In terms of the sort of modal share shift, and in particular, I suppose, the shift away from private car use, I wanted to flag up, obviously I represent Croydon and Sutton, so specifically thinking about areas like that. I don't know how aware you are, or the sort of policy people in this area, of how different a conversation, let's say in this part of London, or many other parts of London where public transport is quite widespread, how that lands in those boroughs. And I'll give you an example. So like many people, I consider how I'm going to make a journey. So 2 journeys I made this weekend. On Saturday, I had to go over to Croydon from home. The options were 31 minutes by car, 30 minutes by bike, and 50 minutes by public transport. So I think it should be quite apparent why people who aren't maybe as willing as I am to cycle for half an hour might not want to, effectively 40 minutes on a round trip. And then on Sunday, I made a trip to Sutton, and the timings were 16 minutes by car, 19 minutes by bike, or 47 minutes by public transport, and 60 minutes walking. So the public transport is very nearly as long as walking, and 3 times as long as a car or a bike. And so when we have this conversation here about how everyone should be giving up their car and instead, switching to public transport, are those the kinds of numbers that you have in mind that are the choices, the modal shift choices that people in Sutton or Croydon might face, and how can we have that conversation that sounds real to people who, when they're thinking about switching, those are the journey times that they're looking at?
No, I think they're good points. I mean, certainly my view as your Transport Commissioner would be that you can't just cajole people into giving up their cars. You can't just implore them to do that. You've got to create a viable, attractive alternative. And there are a number of factors that need to be present in order to meet that definition. Journey time being one, cleanliness of the service, ease of use of the service, make it easy to use. It's obviously got to be safe, and it's got to be convenient. So you won't otherwise just get people out of their car if the alternative is unattractive in terms of any of those factors, I would suggest. So those are factors that we continually look at, and that, to me, is how you get people to make that modal shift. You can't just tell them if when they try the alternative, the reality is unattractive.
Well, I mean, if I can speak for myself, I opted not to try what the 47-minute public transport journey would look like, and I suspect most people probably wouldn't. I mean, my point is, notwithstanding punctuality and cleanliness and all the rest of it, the conversation about, why people might choose to have a car, I think the conversation that we have in public around that often tends to assume that they are stupid, or I think the Walking and Cycling Commissioner published a tweet yesterday saying that people don't understand the cost of owning a car. And, when you see a journey time difference of 16 minutes or 47 minutes, it feels to me as if we're sort of trying to browbeat people and tell them that they're stupid or wrong, when perhaps the conversation coming the other way might suggest what we're asking of people is not realistic.
Well, you used the word browbeat, I used the word cajole. So in many ways, they're one and the same. I think it's facile to just say to people, that's a bad practice, you must not do that, if you don't make the alternative attractive. So I unashamedly advocate for public transport. You'd find it odd if I didn't. I've been doing this now for 33 years. And I've never owned a car in my life. But that's my choice. I'm not saying that everyone is able to make that commitment or statement. But I do think, as a public transport advocate, that you must make the offer attractive. And for that, you must have the funding to make it attractive. So I want certainly to see public transport put on a level playing field, such that we've got a fighting chance of making that offer attractive, so that you end up with a virtuous cycle. So if get sufficient people migrating to public transport, those that choose not to or can't and continue to use their car, they themselves would also benefit, because the roads would be less congested, because there would be fewer people using cars, because more people would be using buses and trains. So if you get it right, it's kind of a win-win.
Well, I don't want to prolong the conversation. I suppose what I would say is I'm not sure of a TfL funding settlement, past or present or future, in this world or the next, that is likely to close a gap that is that big. And I mean, that is unusually large, but 2 to 1 is quite common. And I think what I would say is that the question is not about funding, it's about the practicalities of delivering public transport in a relatively less dense, more suburban part of London, where there isn't an installed base of tube lines, for example. And even though in Croydon there is the tram, most of Croydon doesn't have the tram. I'll leave that line of questioning there, because I just want to make the point that it's all very well saying that with more funding or with cleaner services, people would switch. People aren't going to switch if it takes twice as long, and I don't see any plan on the table for it not to take twice as long. That would be my point. Finally, for me anyway, on safety and the Mayor's Vision Zero on 0 deaths, and on the transport network, obviously including roads and on public transport. How confident are you that the 2041 0 deaths figure is on track?
I think it's my view would be it's still on track, but it is still going to be a challenge. It was always a challenging target, but we're determined to achieve that target, to hit that target, precisely because of the nature of that target. We shouldn't be passive towards people being killed or seriously injured on our streets. We should be aiming to hit that target. So we've achieved a 52% reduction in 2020 in the total number of people killed or seriously injured against the 2005-2009 baseline. The number of people killed or seriously injured on a bus fell by 35% between 2019 and 2020. What else have I got? The number by 2019, London reduced the number of people being killed or seriously injured by 39%, with a reduction of 65% amongst under 16. So there's lots of statistics, but I look at those because they're indicators to me, are we on track? Ideally, I'd like to see greater statistics, but the goal here, obviously, is to minimise risk to people such that we do hit that 2041 target.
I don't want to delay the committee now. We did spend quite a bit of time on this in January, December, and what I would say on the figures, firstly, it makes no sense to me, and I don't think it makes sense to anyone else on the committee, not to speak for them. The baseline that you've chosen, which is very many years before the project started, and quite a lot of the reductions that you just mentioned were before the project started. And I think, I anyway personally find that a curious way to claim credit for things that happened before you even started the thing that you are claiming the credit for them through. And then obviously in the last couple of years, we've seen so many fewer people out and about due to the pandemic that obviously has an unmeasurable impact. The thing that I really wanted to bring up, though, is the question, well, we took evidence from a bus driver, and I've subsequently been approached by other bus drivers, and the impression that I get very strongly is that they don't seem, it's not that they're not on board with the Vision Zero, it's just that it appears to be a conversation that's happening not in their garage, not in their cab, not in their lives, and there appear to be, people like us sitting in rooms like this talking about Vision Zero, perhaps people at your level talking about Vision Zero, but then when you talk about what is actually going on in the, day-to-day, hour-by-hour activity of somebody driving a bus along our roads, it doesn't seem to be reaching them. They don't understand how it's supposed to impact on them. So I don't know whether you're aware of the evidence that we took, and whether you've thought about that since. But how do you actually get that message, and not just a message, but behaviour differences to that operational level?
Sure. Well, I haven't seen the specific bits of evidence to which you referred. I'd welcome that. Actually, it would be good for me to have a look at that if you wouldn't mind furnishing it to me. But what I can say is I can't speak for every bus driver, but we do, through our contractors and our partners, our business partners on the bus side, we do talk to bus operators and involve bus operators in vision safety initiatives. And the reason I can say that with certainty is I've participated in one. I went to Shepherd's Bush garage not so long ago, and I sat in with a session of bus operators who were undertaking an exercise on Vision Zero initiatives, including the road environment and hazards to look out for. And literally, we were using 3D vision, virtual reality headsets, where you watched a video and you were looking for specific risks and anticipating what road users and pedestrians might do. And then there was quite a healthy debate after that about the relevance of what we've been doing in terms of vehicle design, road design, regulations, and the bus operators by and large were pretty well informed. Now I get that was one microcosm, that was one garage, but those debates and that information do go on.
I feel confident in agreeing with you that the debates go on. The sense that I have picked up, though, as a new Assembly member, so this may be wrong, but the sense that I get is that TfL, so you have this sort of three-stage, you've got the TfL, stroke us here in City Hall, and then you've got the bus operators, and then you've got the bus drivers. And there seems to be almost a Chinese wall somewhere in there. Seems to be what's happening. And I don't know that TfL, when there's a problem, seem to be quite happy to point to the bus operator and say, well, it's the bus operator's job to operate the bus network safely, and take a slightly hands-off approach. And then when I speak to bus drivers, if I could put it diplomatically, they think that the bus operators are mainly concerned with timetables and profitability, and they're not so concerned about safety. So I suppose my question is, how do you join that up end to end? Does TfL, through the contracts that it agrees with the bus operators, does it give safety as much priority as bus operator or the bus controller on the radio to the driver, telling them to speed up, not so much telling them to be safe, for example. So how does TfL use its powers in setting the contracts with bus operators to actually take responsibility for it? Because I do get the sense that I don't think that, I'm not sure that happens.
Okay. The TfL responsibility is to set the policy, to set the safety framework. So we set out overall what these safety standards are that are to be achieved, and the policy objectives that collectively we are to achieve. That is a factor contained specifically and explicitly contained within the tendering arrangement and the contracting arrangement that we deploy. In other words, you will not win a franchise or win a concession if you do not sign up to participating in and adhering to that safety framework. So we oversee that. So we're not passive to that. We don't, contrary to what you may have been told, just delegate policy and framework to the operators. On the contrary, we stipulate that to the operators. But you made the point about it's the contractors, or the impression given is that we see it as the bus operators' responsibility to operate their buses safely. Absolutely it is. They are best placed to do that. They are the controlling minds at the local depots in terms of interaction with their operators, discipline of their operators, performance management of their operators, training of their operators. But I stress that it has to be done within an overall framework that we set.
So bus driver fatigue, for example, fatigue management is obviously a very important part of that, making sure that the shift patterns, for example, don't induce fatigue. How much involvement does TfL have in firstly setting sort of industry best practice for bus operators to adhere to, and secondly, to checking whether that actually happens?
Yeah. So again, we set the framework. TfL sets the framework, and we do that not just by picking arbitrary figures. We've commissioned independent research on the health risks to bus drivers across the industry. So not specific to a particular operator, but across the industry. Again, using an evidence-based approach. So we've done a study with academia on what are the critical factors behind bus driver fatigue, things like circadian rhythms, and making sure that the shifts don't, the shift patterns don't contribute to that fatigue. And the shifts themselves are structured in such a way so as to minimize fatigue. There's a lot of science around this. Plus, we make sure that there is proactive learning between bus operators. So if one bus operator, for example, has some sort of safety-related incident that might be transferable, it's not a one-off, might be transferable to one of the other operators, again, we share that. We have a bus safety program. We've led on what's called the Health and Wellbeing Innovation Challenge jointly with bus operators, and we will be rolling out bus fatigue technology, detection technology, which looks at your eyes to see if there's evidence of fatigue, and that will be rolled out to 500 buses by the end of 2022. So my point is, again, we set the framework, we set the standards, we set the policies, and we, via the contracts, we make sure that the various contractors comply with those. But it's a two-way thing. Equally, if a contractor has good practice, best practice, a lot of them are internationals that we can learn from and then share to the other contractors. We're very much alive to that.
So in terms of, apologies, Chair, my very final question then. So in terms of this fatigue management with bus drivers, because I think what you've said is not that different from what I've said. Perhaps you've couched it in less accusatory language, which is fair enough. But it does feel as if we're still in a position whereby if individual bus drivers feel that their operator isn't taking fatigue seriously, or if the shift management patterns that they're implementing aren't say comparable with what the railway industry would do, which is another area where this comes up a lot. What actual role does TfL take, or in your view, could or should they take, to actually impose on operators, let's say by the contract, that they do actually live up to that best practice and don't just have let's say, a conversation about it, which everybody then leaves the room and carries on doing what they were doing before?
Well, our director of buses has regular dialogue both with the collective of the various bus entities, but also with them on a bilateral basis with individual bus companies, at which safety is an agenda item. So we would look at any anonymous reports that have been sent to us. We would look at the root causes of any incidents that had occurred. We will look at data in terms of the numbers of safety incidents or accidents to customers or to members of staff that have occurred. So there's quite the challenge process to make sure that operators aren't just giving us lip service, but that are actively fulfilling the terms of their contracts and taking a proactive approach to safety. So that dialogue does go on.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. I think that might be something coming out in our Vision Zero letter in due course. Assemblymember Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Just while we're on a bus theme, I'm going to carry on with that from a slightly different angle. I just want to ask the good public transport experience theme of the Mayor's transport strategy. TfL are obviously, without sort of a better deal or a longer-term deal from governments, TfL, it seems that we could see as much of an 18% decline of bus services under a managed decline scenario. Is it possible that we could still have a good public transport experience with that sort of level of decline of the bus services?
I don't believe so, no. I mean, that's certainly a doomsday scenario that we must avoid at all costs, where and of course that's concurrent 18% reduction in bus services with probably a 9% reduction in tube services. So in the round, that constitutes a disastrous, or would constitute, and I stress the conditionality, would constitute a disastrous degradation of London's transport system. Earlier we talked about our aspiration to help sister agencies have London-style transport networks. Well, an 18% reduction on the buses doesn't sound like a London-style transport network to me, because what that would mean is wholesale removal of routes and wholesale butchery of routes that still exist. So we'd be having to take out vehicles, you'd be massively increasing the headways, and what you would do thereby is that probably would lead to the transition of people back into their cars, which I was just discussing with one of your colleagues. And it truly is a downward spiral, because even where there is a bus still on a route, if there was a huge gap ahead of it, it would take longer at each stop because you'd have more people wanting to get on and wanting to get off. So the actual journey time would be prolonged. And that's another further factor in a downward spiral and migration of people away to their cars. We just do not want to go there. I'm still hoping that with government we can avoid that managed decline scenario. It would be disastrous for this city.
Thanks for that. And I mean, I come from a city, Chicago, where we do have those big gaps. And, living in outer London, I can see the difference that a joined up transport system really makes. And I imagine our visitors from St. Lawrence can relate to that as well. I'm just wondering, given the changes in passenger behavior, some of this may be permanent as people look to work from home, or, partly coming into the office, partly working from home. How does that sort of behavior pattern factor into your forward thinking on service levels?
We're still analysing that at the moment. As I said earlier, it's obviously very topical for us in terms of our transport planning team. We're taking soundings not only from looking at our own stats and what ridership's, the emerging pattern of picture on ridership looks like, but we are also taking soundings from CBI and the other agencies which I mentioned earlier, because the key question for me is this a permanent shift, or progressively as the pandemic recedes, will people suddenly rediscover the joys of going to the office? But there's so many variables that have companies in the meantime concluded that they can save money by not having expensive central London accommodation. Have individuals concluded that they don't want to commute anymore, and that actually home working is a viable option. So we don't fully understand that yet. Is it whether or not it's a temporary phenomenon, or is it something longer term? But we've already started our thinking on that, and I think what is already emerging is much more travel in and around sub areas, the likes of Harrow, Croydon, Wimbledon, Stratford. In other words, sub-centres where there does appear to be an uptake in ridership in some of these local areas. And that does seem to be consistent with where people talk about 15-minute neighbourhoods. We may yet end up having to recast the transport offer we've got, so less intense services in central London, and offset some of that with more service in the outer ring.
Yeah, thanks for that. I understand there's a pause on issuing new bus contracts due to financial uncertainty. Is this the case?
That is the case.
Yeah.
And that is not something that I'm happy about, because it's not good for London, and it's certainly not good for the contractors, because they literally do not know whether or not they are going to get the renewed contract. So it's still containable for now, but not for too much longer. We have a number of bus contracts that are on ice, and you know, it's testament to the good relation that we have with our contractors that they are continuing to operate in a period of great uncertainty, but they're stacking up, and we urgently need to unlock that logjam. Again, all the more reason to get our financial situation sorted out, both on OPEX and CAPEX for the long term.
Yeah, thank you. And just yesterday, I was contacted by Mums for Lungs, who are really wanting to see more electric bus routes and hydrogen bus routes and that sort of thing. And you know, it's very, very difficult when we don't have that sort of money to invest going forward. And this stuff, you know, the old polluting buses are directly causing pollution outside of schools and on our high streets and stuff like that. And I think it's really quite difficult to see a way forward at this point when there's certainly the will to want to improve London's air quality, but London seems to be stopped from doing this because of this financial situation.
Sure. Well, I mean, to me, I used the word logjam earlier. It is a logjam, and it's not just to London's detriment. I would argue that it's to the UK's detriment, because you've got, just at the micro level, you've got contractors, bus contractors, who can't commit to anything with certainty because they don't have a contract. So that's a problem, because why would you, if you were a bus contractor, why would you commit to saying, we will buy a whole bunch of new buses and we'll convert a garage with TfL, if you didn't know that A, you were going to get a new contract, B, you didn't know what the value of that contract would be, and C, you didn't know what the duration of that contract would be. You just wouldn't do that. And then similarly, on a macro scale, I made reference to this earlier, you know, there's, to me, such an obvious economic benefit in opening up or enabling the whole-scale conversion of not just London, but the whole-scale conversion of the UK bus fleet to electric or hydrogen. For that matter, hydrogen is a very interesting technology. But let's say low-emission or zero-emission technology, because you would get the benefit of bus manufacturers having a known order book, and therefore being able to plan with certainty and to give much better unit prices to individual municipalities. Other municipalities would benefit. So I'll just pick one, I probably shouldn't, but say a municipality outside London, Leeds or somewhere, wanted to electrify its bus fleet. I'm not sure that in itself would, and it would prompt a bus manufacturer to set up a bespoke production line for one municipality. There's just not the economy of scale, there's not the size of order. But if London, with 9,500 buses, the biggest bus fleet in Europe, commits to progressive electrification of its bus fleet, then I think there will be knock-on benefits to all the various other municipalities, Leeds, Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester, Bristol, Plymouth. You know, progressively, these other municipalities would benefit from our economies of scale and our purchasing power.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Do you want to do C and D for you? Or shall I? I'll just. Yeah, or Ellie, do you want to do them, C and D? Yeah.
Apologies, Commissioner. Just handing the questions round. It's just a couple of questions around the housing targets in the transport strategy, correct? Yeah. So how achievable are the targets of housing that Transport for London has set out given the current financial restraints?
Well, I think similar to what I've said on some of the other elements of our mandate, they're not going to be easy because we have lost some time, obviously, with the pandemic. And the original target was 10,000 homes to be in 2020-21, and 10,000 starts, I think that was. Now, the actual is way down upon that for a number of reasons. In some cases, building partners have not brought forward schemes because they themselves have been impacted by the pandemic. But in other cases, we ourselves have put up schemes and they've been knocked back. And a good example of that would be, I'll just give you some examples. There were 35 TfL schemes heard at Planning Committee, of which 34 had positive officers' recommendations to approve. So that sounds like a done deal, right? The officers have said, let's approve them. However, at committee, 5 of those 34 were refused at committee. So I'll give you some examples. Stanmore, 277 homes, Kidbrooke, 619, Arnos Grove, 162, Cannons Park, 118, Sudbury Town, 52, and South Kensington, 50. We are pushing on as best we can with our housing strategy, including in line with government a government request setting up a separate housing agency. But in order to get the houses built and to start the building, we've obviously got to have planning permission, and that is proving to be quite a challenge in a number of locations, the most recent being Arnos Grove. So we're not going to give up on it, but it is a tough environment out there right now.
Thank you. And how will the new TTLP company work in delivering more homes faster and more efficiently?
Well, it will be a separate entity. We're working on the detail at the moment. It is being worked upon. That work has not yet concluded, but it is something that we're actively discussing with government. It is one of the government conditions that should be set up. It would still have oversight ultimately from the TfL board, but it would be an arm's length entity which could have much more access to private capital. So I see benefit in having that structure and having a bespoke CEO as in charge of that structure. Ultimately, as long as it achieves the objective, which is to get as close to that 10,000 starts target, I'm very comfortable with the revised governance arrangement.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Assemblymember Berry.
Thank you very much. So I wanted just to quickly loop back, if that's all right, to the line of questioning before from Assemblymember Garrett, because I think that really does illustrate quite the problems and the difficult choices people, particularly in outer London, are having to make. I just wanted to draw your attention, if you hadn't seen it already, Andy, to the data I got by surveying Londoners about whether or not they felt like they were forced to own a car. Mm-hmm. And that data was really, genuinely, wanting to listen to people's needs, genuinely shocking. People in outer London, about half of them don't own a car. But of the half that do, half of them, so nearly a quarter of people in outer London, feel like they are forced to own a car. And I don't think we are properly serving them. So I know you've discussed some of the issues and how that might be solved with Assemblymember Garrett, but other issues that I've raised in the past include things like the cost of fares from outer London. Mm-hmm. That is going to be a factor somewhere in there. And I just wondered if there was anything that you're doing to try and simplify fares, working with national rail companies, for example, to try and solve some of those cost issues for people in Outer London.
Well, certainly, as I think I mentioned in my answer to Assemblymember Garrett, that affordability is one of those factors, along with quality of service, frequency, cleanliness of service, feelings of safety, etc. There's a lot of factors that encourage people to use public transport and get them to maintain their patronage. Certainly, the more that we can work with National Rail, for example, to have simplification of fares, because it is quite daunting at the moment, the number of fares and the complexity of the fare structure, and in some cases the cost of rail travel, that can be a real deterrent to people. So I think one of the benefits potentially of GBR, which we talked about earlier, Great British Railways, which we talked about earlier, is surely, if it's a national body with that kind of mandate, surely, finally, we should be able to simplify the fare structure and hopefully across the country make sure that the system's affordable. Otherwise, you are risking people being forced to use a car, which I don't like. I have no problem with if someone chooses to use a car. This is a democracy. That's your prerogative. Of course, you can use a car. I choose not to. But it shouldn't be the case that you're forced to use a car. Definitely not.
And that's really useful to hear. So presumably, I mean, your discussions with government might also include trying to get some sort of help from them to negotiate on national fares. I mean, one thing that really bothers me is the amount that the fare goes up, the sort of the rail card fare goes up, and the single fares go up as you move to Outer London. It doesn't seem right to me that people who have the least service pay the most for getting onto the tube. So this zonal system seems to me out of date. But presumably within that, one of the factors is the amount we have to reimburse the national rail companies for the legs of the journeys that people take on their services. But it would benefit the whole country for more Londoners to be using National Rail, for there to be some sort of good deal. Is that something you're maybe asking for London, from government, as some sort of quid pro quo?
Well, certainly, I don't think the status quo really works in terms of the fact that some fares are very high across the National Rail network. You know, they're quite eye-watering, actually, when you see the fares quoted. And so the counter or the argument often given is, oh, but that's just the headline figure. There's actually, if you look, there's actually a much cheaper fare. Well, quite often there is, but trying to find it is extremely difficult because there is such a...
Can I be clear that I'm asking you about the amount we reimburse for things like travel cards, rather than, like going to Manchester on a whim is very, very expensive. We all know that.
So can you just repeat the question? I might obviously misunderstood.
So it's the proportion of travel card income that we reimburse to the national rail companies. Presumably, there is a formula that is used there that is based in some way on national rail fares, and which leads to part of the increase in overall fares that we have to pay, and particularly the increased cost for Outer London must be partly trying to bear that extra cost that we pay to them.
Sure. So I think that is the case. I wouldn't say that is my area of expertise, but I do have people who regularly, whose job it is to do that kind of analysis. And if you'll bear with me, I'll get a written response to you on that point.
No problem. It would be really useful to have some sort of meeting, actually, because I know that the opportunities around renegotiating the fares agreement in general are really high right now. But it is hard to engage with because those fares agreements are sort of secret because they are with private companies. But
we have expertise in TfL who know all the ins and outs of that, and I would be happy to facilitate a meeting.
We do indeed. And then one particular bugbear of mine that I've just developed is I've been using the HS1 Javelin train as a bit of a handy shortcut from St Pancras to Stratford on my way to New City Hall. And I'm quite aware that this is a very expensive option. It's about an extra £3 a day for me to do this. And I'm privileged enough to be able to afford that. A working person factoring that extra cost into a working week is not It's not going to happen. So is there any chance of maybe bringing that into the zonal system as well?
Well, that wouldn't be entirely within TfL's gift because we don't operate that service. But that's and my mantra in life, Assembly Member, is anything's possible. So that could always be factored in.
And you will ask, will you? Is that the answer?
Sure, I can mention that when I get back to speak to that, funny enough, self-same expert to whom I referred earlier.
Thank you very much.
I think, well, let's try and get a briefing in the next year with Shashi Verma.
How did you guess?
So, and we can pick up some of these issues. Now, members, I'm really conscious of time. I've got two people who've indicated to come in on this question. Assembly Member Prince and Bailey, do you still want to come in? Okay, and then we'll move on to the final section. Assembly Member Prince. You need to put your microphone on, please. And
I believe we were talking about housing a bit earlier.
we were.
Part of your target is around selling land and providing housing. I don't know if you're aware, Commissioner, that there was a letter from Grant Schaps, it's only dated March 2022, regarding the sale of Cockfosters station land and his refusal to permit that. Does that put a bit of a spoke in the wheels or whatever the phrase
Yeah,
is?
I'm aware of that. So he refused it. It was what's called a Section 163 application, and my understanding is it was refused on the grounds it didn't provide enough parking for commuters. 96% of whom passed an alternative train station on their way to parking their cars. So we felt that was a reason to proceed with the application, but the Secretary of State, in his opinion, didn't concur. So we're seeking to understand better the rationale behind that decision, and that's the current status of it.
Okay, lovely. Assembly Member Bailey.
I just be brief. We might have to talk about this outside here. But at what point does running a full service in London, in view of the fact that it looks like the pandemic has changed people's behaviour, become unjustifiable? How do we say to the 50% of Londoners who don't use public transport they're expected to subsidise it, or the maybe 80% of the rest of the population who don't use public transport, they're meant to subsidise London transport? Because a lot of the conversation talks about London not getting a fair deal, etc., etc. But I bumped into someone from Liverpool this morning on the train, and he was telling us about our £17 billion single train line, and that's probably more than they spend on transport in Liverpool in total. So at what point do we have to accept there may be changes to the level of transport in London, and how are TfL making the argument to government beyond the obvious? We're the engine of the economy. We're the engine of the economy, for instance, who are asking for £500 million back in one fell swoop. If I speak of vehicle VED. When and how are we making that justification for having such a disproportionate level of national transport funding?
Well, I think one of the problems with the polarised discussion at the moment, which seems to be wanting to pit London against the rest of the country. I use the word polarised deliberately. I think we've got to try and move away from that. Yes, absolutely, there is a need to improve the transport provision in other places. And a classic example would be, and I once tried to do it, to go across the Pennines does take forever when it's actually not that great a distance. But there's this view that there should be an HS3 going from, say, Liverpool to Hull, and maybe one day that should happen. But I just counsel against. The levelling up means the North and the Midlands now get everything and London doesn't get anything, because I just feel that will be counterproductive, in that if London's transport system degrades, over time the capital will suffer, and the capital's ability to generate £37 billion net to the Exchequer to fund the levelling up north and in the Midlands will be impacted. And I did read that comment actually about the person from Liverpool saying, well, hang on a minute, how come London gets this £17 billion railway? Well, the North and the Midlands will benefit from HS2. The last time I checked, that was a £100 billion railway. is what's being talked about in terms of mooted on the projected final cost. Now, it's not my scheme, so I don't know if that's absolutely accurate, but let's just say it's an order of magnitude above what Crossrail costs, because that's what we're talking about. So I don't think it's accurate to say that the North and the Midlands are being left behind.
Okay.
I agree. I don't want to get
Let's
into that
move on
argument. The
then.
chair is pressed for time,
Yes.
so we'll pick it up a different time.
Sure.
But it's clear that we are streaks ahead of what's going on in the rest of the country.
Okay, let's move on to our final section, looking at longer-term priorities, and Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, my lead-off question for this section is very broad, and I think you could probably talk about it for a long time. So maybe just a few bullet points,
Sure.
if that's all right. But what are your longer-term vision and priorities for London's transport network, and what will success look like? So
Okay.
Just a small.
So I would say, in no particular order, a progressively more sustainable transport system. So one that is predicated on an electrified bus fleet. So zero emissions bus fleet, could be hydrogen as well. One that has been fully modernised, so that the remaining tube lines that have yet to receive an upgrade in either their rolling stock or signalling, that has been addressed. That our state of good repair on all modes, including roads and critical assets such as Gallows Corner flyover, have been put right and brought back to a state of good repair. So there's no further talk of taking assets out of use. That is more dynamic as a transport system, that applies the right mode and the right level of service to the right part of the city, so that we should embrace things like last mile micro-mode transport. And that is an inherently more efficient TfL that provides ultimate value for money to the taxpayer. Those would be things that would be on my to-do list. Plus, I still would like to see the big ticket schemes such as HS2, Docklands Light Rail extension to Lewisham, and the Bakerloo line extension come back above the line at some point. Those would all be things on my longer-term radar.
Thank you very much. Earlier this month, the Mayor announced further expansion of the ULEZ zone. When do you anticipate consulting on this, and what kind of overall timetable are you working to at TfL?
Well, we anticipate consulting soon, because the Mayor, in investigating potential options to reduce air pollution, carbon emissions and congestion, was presented. He commissioned work by TfL to come up with 4 options, and the one, as I mentioned earlier, is the ultra-low emission zone. That is his preferred option, London-wide ULEZ in 2023. So we would be starting that consultation in May, potentially, and running for that consultation we anticipate to last 10 weeks. I think is correct. Just 1 second. Yeah, correct. Starting in May, lasting 10 weeks. Time's of the essence if we're to hit the time frame for implementation.
Thank you. And sorry, the timetable you're working for is 2023. I missed if you gave a specific month or specific quarter of 2023 for implementation.
It's partly driven by the what comes out of the consultation. So we're saying 2023. We can become progressively more specific once we see what the output of the consultation is. But certainly, time is of the essence. We've got to get started. And that would then allow us to implement London-wide ULEZ by 2023, which is a really tough time frame, particularly to get all the physical works done, but then sets the principles for a next generation scheme by 25-26. That being a broader RUC, road user charging scheme.
Well, thank you. And on that, my next question, what work are you carrying out to develop a road user charging scheme, which is apparently going to replace all current existing schemes? And you mentioned the timescales there, but what other sort of critical points in that time frame are there?
Well, we've already we've commissioned a team. We've, again, as much as I said to Assemblymember Berry, in another area of TfL, we also have real expertise, I'd say world-class expertise actually, on road user charging. So we've set up a team, and the team is working under the direction of my Deputy Commissioner, Gareth Powell, the Chief Customer and Strategy Officer. So that team has started its work. So that will oversee both the extension of the ultra-low emission zone, if that's enabled by the consultation, for 2023 implementation, and if RUC does indeed become a reality, then that would be possibly able to be achieved as early as 25-26, but that's only a very ballpark figure at the moment. We've only just started looking at that work.
Thank you. You mentioned the team looking at this has what is world-leading global expertise. That's quite interesting because there are various different sort of schemes in different cities around the world that approach this from different ways. You can have very sort of blunt instrument approach if you buy a sticker, for example, you put in your car. You have cameras. There's discussions around black boxes in cars, apps on phones. I know it's early days, but what is your thinking on the different types of options, and what other places around the world are you looking at to taking some sort of inspiration?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the reason we have that expertise is well, it's not really the reason why, but we have experts, but they don't claim to be omniscient. They are aware of what's going on elsewhere, and it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship, because equally people come to London to see how do we implement the congestion charge, how have we done some other things, but we are aware of schemes going on in other cities, places like Copenhagen, places like Singapore. There are other world-leading authorities out there, the SMRTA in Singapore being a classic example. So we haven't yet settled on a technology. It would be premature to do that, but we ease of implementation and ease of use by participants, in other words, drivers, because you want it to be seamless, will be key factors in the choice of technology. Obviously, cost being another factor, maintainability, future-proofing. There's a number of factors, but we won't make that choice until we've done the study, and it certainly won't be introspective. We will have a look at best practice around the world, in the same way, to be fair, that people come from around the world to see what we do. It's a big community from which we can help each other.
I mean, and on the
Nick,
point...
could you speak into your mic?
They're
struggling
Sorry.
to pick it up.
Thank you, Chair. On the subject of future-proofing, there's other work going on across the sort of transport policy establishment around road user charging. The Transport Select Committee, for example, recently brought out a report on the subject. What discussions are you having beyond London on this? Are you talking about this to the DFT, for example? Because if you can foresee a world in which there is a national road user charging scheme brought in at some point, and you'd want to make sure that anything that London did was compatible with what happened across the rest of the country. Otherwise, you could have to spend a huge amount of money on implementing a scheme that you then start from scratch. So, are you, for example, talking to the DFT? Are you talking wider than
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'll put it this way. I've made the point to the DFT that, again, TfL can be a partner in activities such as this to the ultimate benefit of the UK. So this is again consistent with what I said earlier, in that we can help government with its overall objectives in terms of levelling up and progressive decarbonisation of the UK. If you would just partner with us, I've made the same point on road user charging, because we all know that at some point the Exchequer will have a real problem as fuel duty ebbs away, when people, literally there's no one driving petrol or diesel cars anymore. That's a huge amount of money, excise, that will no longer be available. So there's got to be some sort of new arrangement whereby, from a policy-led objective, I'll say it again, ultimately looking to improve the environment, but if that has the side benefit of also generating monies that can be properly reinvested back into transport, so you get a virtuous cycle, that's worth looking at. Now, so the point I made to government was someone's got to go first. We in London have already got expertise in terms of what we've already done with the ultra-low emission zone, with the low emission zone, and with the congestion charge. So surely there should be a dividend, an upside for London in potentially going first, because it has the potential to benefit the rest of the country. But in a way, my pitch to government is you don't get out for now. So surely that's one of the reasons why we should be looked upon favourably for a capital deal, because we cannot do some kind of or we can't undertake a major road user charging scheme or even the expanded ULEZ without capital support, because that comes at a cost. But that's why I want the government to look beyond the cost and beyond the politics to see there's national benefit in having TfL go first and trailblaze.
Thank you. And a final question for me. In the work that you're doing, both on the ULEZ expansion and more broadly on road user charging, what kind of discussions are you having around scrappage schemes?
Well, that's been very successful, the scrappage scheme, and certainly in any expansion of the ULEZ to Greater London in the way the Mayor has directed us to look, we would need to look at a refreshed scrappage pot, because for the same reasons as we had one in the first case, that some people do need assistance to get rid of their old vehicle to buy a compliant vehicle. So that is a factor we've also been asked to look at. What might that pot look like in terms of quantum and eligibility?
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Lovely, thank you. And hope mobility credits will feature as part of that scrappage
We're looking at all
scheme.
aspects, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Berry, finally.
Thank you very much, Chair. So just to carry on with a few questions about the potential road charging scheme. Just to be clear, your 10-week consultation you mentioned on the wider ultra emission zone, that is essentially a statutory consultation.
Yeah, well, so what I should say is we are going to invite you. This might help cut things short, because we're going to invite you to a briefing to hear more about the consultation process, what it covers, what it looks like. Is it just statutory or does it go beyond that? You'll get a full briefing and you'll be able to ask questions of the experts. We're about to send you an invite.
Okay, I mean, obviously here today we get a transcript and everything goes on the record, so it's useful to know if that is going to be a statutory consultation.
That is my understanding. It's a statutory consultation. We are aware that we need to follow a proper process, and so we certainly will be doing that.
And then for the wider road user charging, will there also be questions about that as a kind of non-statutory, tell us what you think question to the general public? Because I think it's really important. I've been talking for ages about the need to have a big conversation with Londoners about a scheme like this because of the implications for their daily lives.
Well, we'd like you to shape our thinking in what that consultation, or rather in what the scheme looks like. So that's the consultation. It's effectively our consultation with you about what the scheme might look like in terms of distance driven, emissions, time, road danger. So if you wouldn't mind, just hold that thought for when we hold the session. My experts will be at that session and you can help shape that debate.
Okay, great.
Because we want to ask you as key stakeholders.
I mean, and I think asking Londoners as well is equally important. Now, you listed a number of factors that you need to consider a moment ago. You did not mention privacy, so I'm going to, because I'm slightly obsessed with the privacy aspects of this scheme. And that's really important that is discussed with the public as well.
My omission, that is a factor, absolutely.
Good. Because, I mean, our report as a committee, London Stalling, mentioned that as long ago as 2017. The Transport Select Committee didn't have any witnesses who are privacy experts come before them. They were mostly motoring groups, and I think again that was a gap in their investigation. And I don't think you should leave that gap. Basically, if I can recommend. There are a number of groups out there who are very expert on privacy, and because this will be a smart scheme, groups that are involved in online and digital privacy in particular, I think, are ones you should be speaking to. And these include Big Brother Watch and also Open Rights Group, who I've had very productive discussions with both of them in relation to this particular issue before. And I think if you're not already speaking to them, you should be. They are campaigning groups. They have access to experts who've worked in advisory roles in other cities on these kinds of issues, but also they're really plugged into public opinion. They'll help raise any red flags you need to worry about.
Okay, that's great. We'll feed that back to the people doing the consultation. I'll certainly make that point to them.
Great, and yeah, speak to them earlier rather than later, I think. Right, now moving on to a completely different issue. The e-scooter trial. Can you tell us anything about what that's shown you about the risks and opportunities that cover many different aspects too about legalising e-scooters in London?
So I think it's been so far so good with the scooter trial. We have succeeded in getting more boroughs to participate, and certainly the take-up has been enthusiastic. People like the scooters. They find them easy to undock, to actually the actual mechanics of ordering a scooter or booking a scooter and taking one out. That's certainly been proven to be a success. And I've got some stats here. Since the launch in June 2021, we've had over 660,000 journeys. So that reiterates that point that the people like the product. And the fleet size has increased from 600 scooters to just short of 4,000, actually 3,885. And we've now got 10 boroughs participating. So I think what it's told us is that there's a demand out there, that people like the product. They like the ease of getting hold of a scooter and being able to dock it in increasing numbers of places across London. And I think what it's also demonstrated to us, no surprise to us, is that there is the private fleet of scooters, which let's put back on or reiterate for the record, are illegal. They are not supposed to be on the streets. They are not supposed to be on pavements. Our scooter fleet is inherently safer than those illegally purchased and operated scooters. We have bigger wheels. We've got all sorts of safety features built in. You have to undertake an assessment before you can book one of these scooters. So I think ultimately they're here to stay. I'd be surprised if we've concluded the trial wasn't going to go forward. I think people have they've taken to them, and it's certainly we want to see the private scooters subjected to the same safety regulations that we have imposed upon our own fleet. And then finally, we're not stopping there. We're looking to add a sound, a sort of an audible buzzer to each of the scooters, a bit like with electric bikes, so that people with hearing impairment can hear them coming.
Okay, that's a really useful summary. Thank you very much. One thing that I've anecdotally heard from people who are using these e-scooters, and also people who've been using the higher electric bikes as well, is about the sort of longevity of the machines, the whether or not they last. And are you going to be looking at the sort of throughput of machines and material as part of the trial as well? Because I mean, obviously there's the carbon in use and there's the air pollution aspects, but there's also the embodied carbon of producing and then scrapping lots of machines potentially.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would want them to be robust enough that we weren't having to replace them all the time. And obviously we get them through 3 contractors, and I'm sure those contractors are equally looking at that, because it's in their interest to do so. They don't want to be having to replace them. I'm not aware of any longevity concerns yet. They're pretty robust. They've been designed to be robust because, you occasionally see them lying on their side, but they're well constructed. As I said, they've got speed inhibitors built in. They can't go into certain areas because you will literally lose power. There's all sorts of clever, innovative features in our scooter fleet that do not exist in the somewhat thrown together, privately poorer build quality ones that you see out on the streets, which shouldn't be there.
Chair, do members have any follow-ups on scooters before I go to the final broad question? Okay, great. In that case, one final question. We've asked you about a lot of issues that look ahead and look forwards today. Are there any other long-term areas that you might want to draw to our attention that Transport for London are looking at that we're not aware of, particularly in respect of the next transport strategy or future?
I think I've largely summarised them. I don't think I have anything to add to my list.
Okay, well, you never know what you don't know, so we thought we'd better ask.
But of
Thank
course,
you
it's
very
not
much.
just for me. I mean, I've restructured TfL, as you know. I've restructured the top tier, the executive, such that we're a much more coherent unit. And I'm certainly very interested in canvassing not only the opinions of my executive colleagues to better inform the transport strategy going forward, but also the wider organisation. We're trying to be less hierarchical. We put together a vision and values document, which I think we've given you copies of. We certainly, the board, have had copies of it. That was deliberately generated from the frontline staff themselves. What do you want from your TfL? There's lots of good ideas out there. I want to tap into them. I'm not claiming to have all the answers. Definitely not.
Excellent. I know we've talked before about how the organisation needs to be less siloed as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Great. That's everything.
Thank you very much. And the briefing you talked about, I think, is this Friday.
Excellent.
Sadly, I can't attend, but I'm sure other colleagues will, and we
Okay.
will feed back to the committee. So can I thank you, Andy, Commissioner, for attending this morning and for your answers to our questions. There's a few things we're going to follow up in writing. Committee, can we note the report and the discussion, and also delegate authority to me as Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chairman and Party Group Lead members to agree any output from this meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. The date of our next meeting will be confirmed at the London Assembly's annual meeting. This is the last Transport Committee of this municipal year, so can I thank the Deputy Chairman, Assembly Member Keith Prince, Group Leads and Committee members for their commitment over the year, and look forward to a good year next year as well. I've got no other urgent business, so the meeting is now
Chair,
closed.
before you bang the gavel, can I just, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your service. It's been excellent, and we're very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, committee. And I end our meeting. Thank you.